Hey guys, tonight we are diving deep into a topic so profoundly unremarkable, so subtly fascinating, that it might just be the perfect antidote to wakefulness. Forget the grand battles, the sweeping dynasties, the revolutionary inventions. We're focusing on something far more intimate, far more awkward, the ancient Chinese art of pretending you're full when you absolutely are not. Imagine yourself centuries ago maybe at a modest scholar's table, or even a bustling city restaurant. The air thick with the aroma of simmering pork, steamed fish, and fragrant rice. Dishes are piled high, bowls overflow, and your stomach, frankly, is staging a dramatic opera of emptiness. But your host is watching, your table mates are observing, and politeness, social standing, and maybe even a bit of personal safety, you don't want to seem too ravenous. Do you dictate that you couldn't possibly eat another bite? You probably won't survive this without at least one yawn, maybe two. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're there, aren't you? Seated on a low stool perhaps, or kneeling formally on a mat. The light flickers from oil lamps, or maybe just the fading sunbeams filtering through paper windows. The table is set. It might be low to the ground or slightly raised depending on the era and the host's status. Before you lies an array of food that would make a modern buffet look like a modest snack. This isn't just dinner. It's a performance, a social ritual, a display of generosity, prosperity, and interconnectedness. And right now, your stomach is doing that rumbling thing that usually only happens during a particularly boring meeting. But outward appearances must be maintained. The sheer pressure to navigate these meals was immense. Eating wasn't just about sustenance. It was a complex language. How you ate, how much you ate, how you interacted with the dishes and the people around you, it all spoke volumes. And one of the trickiest phrases in this language was the unspoken one. I am perfectly satisfied, thank you, even though I could probably consume this entire roasted duck myself and still eye the steamed buns. So the need arose for tactics, for subtle deceptions, for the forgotten tricks of appearing full in ancient China. It wasn't just about being polite, it was often about signaling your social savvy, your understanding of etiquette, and sometimes, believe it or not, about managing expectations in a world where food could be both abundant display and underlying scarcity. Think about it from their perspective. A host in ancient China would often measure their success, their generosity, and their social standing by the sheer quantity and variety of food they offered. To have guests leave hungry or even just looking like they could eat more was a slight, potential loss of face. So they'd keep piling it on. More rice, wine, more braised vegetables, another plate of dumplings, perhaps some exotic fruit brought from afar. It was an escalating arms race of hospitality. And caught in the middle were you, the guest, trying to balance genuine appreciation with the very real physiological limits of your own digestive system, all while adhering to a set of unspoken rules. One of the simplest pressures came from the concept of leaving enough for others. In many contexts, particularly in communal dining settings, which were common, diving into a dish with unrestrained gusto wasn't just poor manners, it was selfish. You were expected to take a modest portion to savor it, and then pause, giving others a chance. If you kept scooping things onto your plate, especially from a shared serving dish, you might be seen as greedy, uncouth, or lacking consideration. But what if you were genuinely still hungry? What if that small portion barely touched the sides of your stomach, which felt like a vast echoing cavern? This is where the pretense began. You might slow your chewing to an almost glacial pace, making each bite last an eternity. You might carefully rearrange the food on your plate, making it look like you'd made significant progress, even if only a few grains of rice were missing. You might hold your chopsticks poised above a dish for a long time, as if in deep contemplation about which morsel to select, before politely withdrawing them, signaling, "Oh, perhaps I'll return to that later. I'm quite content with what I have." Mainstream historical accounts of ancient Chinese banquets often describe the lavishness and the sheer number of courses served, sometimes stretching over hours. Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty, for instance, was known for hosting extravagant feasts that showcased the wealth and power of his court. These were not quick meals, they were events. And the longer you sat there, the more food was presented, the greater the challenge became. You couldn't just push your plate away early. That would be a terrible insult. You had to endure, participate, and look like you were enjoying every moment, even if you were strategically loosening your sash under the table. Beyond sheer quantity, there was also the issue of variety. Ancient Chinese cuisine, even centuries ago, was incredibly diverse, influenced by regional specialties and trade routes. A single banquet could feature dishes from different provinces, using ingredients you might never have encountered before. Part of the expected etiquette was to sample everything offered. Refusing a dish outright was difficult, akin to refusing a gift. But if your stomach was already protesting the sheer volume, how could you possibly try that mysterious-looking stew or those elaborate pastries? This necessitated another layer of pretense, the art of taking just a tiny token amount of a dish, moving it around your bowl with your chopsticks, perhaps raising it to your mouth for a very slow chew, and then declaring it delicious even if you weren't sure what you were eating, before setting your chopsticks down and gesturing vaguely towards your midsection with a satisfied sigh. It was theater, pure and simple. A quirky tidbit related to this era is the occasional mention of eating stones or eating clay in times of extreme famine, but juxtaposed with the lavishness of banquets, it highlights the stark contrast in food availability and the resulting social dynamics. While some struggled for mere survival, those hosting banquets were expected to demonstrate overwhelming abundance. This contrast deepened the social significance of food and the way it was consumed. For someone accustomed to scarcity, being faced with such plenty and having to pretend they weren't desperately hungry must have been a peculiar psychological challenge. It wasn't just politeness, it was a performance of being part of the world of plenty, even if you weren't. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for feigning fullness was always politeness towards the host, or sometimes a subtle status symbol in itself, implying you were so accustomed to abundance that another few bowls of expensive noodles were simply unnecessary. It's a fascinating chicken or the egg scenario. Did the host become lavish because guests were expected to hold back, or did guests have to learn to hold back because the hosts were so lavish? It's likely a bit of both, evolving over centuries. Imagine the internal monologue you'd have. Okay, just one more dumpling. Chew slowly, very slowly. Make eye contact with the host, smile. Say something appreciative. Ah, the aroma. That sounds good. Now put the chopsticks down. Don't look at the pork belly. Look at the intricate pattern on the teacup instead. Breathe. You can do this. It's just food. Lots and lots of delicious food that your body desperately wants. It's like being on a particularly strict diet, but the diet is social pressure, and the tempting treats are right there in front of you, and refusing them is rude. There was also the matter of speed. Eating too quickly was, and often still is, considered impolite in many cultures, including ancient China. It suggested you were either uncivilized, incredibly hungry, which could be a sign of low status or desperation, or simply not appreciating the food or the company. So even if your stomach was screaming for you to shovel it in, you had to pace yourself. This meant mastering the art of the leisurely chew, the thoughtful sip of tea between bites, the engagement in conversation that naturally slowed down the eating process. But if you were using these tactics to genuinely slow down your eating so your stomach could catch up and signal fullness, you were on one path. If you were already full or pretending to be and using these same tactics to simply prolong the performance and avoid taking more food, you were on another. The outward behavior could be identical, but the internal state and motivation were different. This brings us to the various specific methods employed. Pretending to be full wasn't just a feeling you projected. It involved concrete actions. One common approach revolved around the visible remnants of the meal. A clean plate or bowl could signal that you were perhaps too hungry or that the host hadn't provided enough. Leaving a small amount of food, particularly the most common staple like rice, was a polite way to show you had been satisfied. It was a delicate balance, though. Leave too much, and it could imply the food wasn't good or you were being wasteful. Leave just the right amount, a few scattered grains of rice, a single piece of vegetable, and it was a quiet declaration of satiety. You might spend an inordinate amount of time chasing that last grain of rice around your bowl with your chopsticks, making a show of trying to finish, before finally giving up with a polite shrug and declaring yourself full. Another layer to this performance involved beverages, particularly tea or rice wine. Sipping these slowly throughout the meal could not only help with digestion or the illusion of it, but also fill up your stomach slightly genuinely, helping with the feeling of fullness or at least creating a physical barrier to consuming solid food. You might emphasize your enjoyment of the tea, praising its fragrance or temperature, using it as an excuse to pause eating and take a long, deliberate sip. "Ah, this tea is simply exquisite," you'd say, holding the small cup delicately, letting the steam rise, and then slowly drinking all, while your eyes subtly darted away from the tempting platter of savory pastries. The social anxiety around these meals must have been palpable. You were constantly being judged subtly on your comportment, your conversation, and your eating habits. Knowing the rules of appearing full was essential social currency. Get it wrong and you might be seen as gauche, ungrateful, or worse. Get it right and you demonstrated your refinement, your understanding of social norms, and your respect for the host. It wasn't just about avoiding discomfort. It was about maintaining your place in the social structure. The sheer quantity of food served, especially at larger banquets, wasn't just for eating, it was part of the display. Piles of steamed buns arranged in impressive towers, whole roasted animals presented dramatically intricate cold dishes sculpted into flowers or animals. This wasn't just dinner, it was edible art and a statement of wealth. Your job as a guest was to appreciate the display, sample the art, and then crucially not devour the entire exhibition. You were meant to admire the abundance and partake respectfully, not to demonstrate your capacity as a human dustbin, no matter how much your empty stomach felt like one. The practice of pretending wasn't necessarily malicious or dishonest in the modern sense. It was a form of social lubrication, a way to navigate potentially awkward situations arising from cultural expectations of hospitality and generosity. It allowed hosts to feel they had provided abundantly and guests to show appreciation without overindulging or seeming greedy. It was a dance and everyone knew the steps, even if the music was the quiet rumbling of your own empty belly. We're just scratching the surface here. This wasn't just about polite refusal. It involved a whole repertoire of subtle techniques, physical maneuvers, and psychological games you played with yourself and your hosts. From the way you handled your chopsticks to the expressions on your face, every detail mattered. And understanding these small, almost invisible actions gives us a surprisingly deep insight into the social fabric of ancient Chinese life, where even the simple act of eating was layered with meaning and expectation. So you're sitting there, stomach grumbling like a distant thunderstorm, but your face is serene, your posture composed. The battlefield isn't just the table laden with food, it's also in your hands, specifically the pair of chopsticks you hold. These aren't just tools for conveying food from bowl to mouth. In the intricate social dance of the ancient Chinese banquet, chopsticks were instruments of communication capable of speaking volumes without a single word being uttered. Mastering their use went far beyond simply picking things up. It involved a sophisticated ballet of gestures, pauses and placements that could signal everything from respect to, crucially, a polite declaration of, "I am delightfully, impossibly full." Think of your chopsticks as extensions of your will, yes, but also as indicators of your state of being. The way you held them, the speed or lack thereof at which you moved them, where you set them down, all of it contributed to the narrative you were weaving about your dining experience. If you were genuinely hungry and less concerned with appearances, or perhaps very low in the social hierarchy where such pretense was less critical, you might wield your chopsticks with efficient purpose, scooping, grasping, and lifting with steady rhythm. But if you were performing the art of being full, your chopstick technique transformed. One of the most common signals of satiety, or at least the performance of it, was the deliberate slowness of movement. You wouldn't just reach for a dish, you'd approach it with the contemplative grace of a calligrapher considering his next stroke. Your chopsticks might hover over a platter, not because you were deciding what to take, but because the mere act of hovering, of considering, without immediately taking suggested you were leisurely, you were satisfied, you were simply appreciating the abundance. This wasn't clumsiness, it was calculated hesitation. You might even tap the side of the bowl lightly with your chopsticks, a soft, almost inaudible click. Not as a drum roll for your next bite, but perhaps as a subtle emphasis on the deliciousness you've already consumed, implying you're still savoring the memory rather than planning the next ingestion. The resting place of your chopsticks was also critical. Never ever just stick them upright in your rice bowl. That's a major no-no, resembling incense sticks offered to the dead. Not exactly the vibe you want at a lively banquet. Instead, when you paused, which when pretending to be full was often, you'd place them carefully across the top of your bowl or on a small chopstick rest if one was provided. Placing them neatly across your bowl was a widely understood signal that you were finished with that particular dish, or perhaps even finished with the meal entirely, at least for the moment. It was a subtle punctuation mark in the sentence of your eating. If you kept picking them up and putting them down repeatedly, it just reinforced the idea that you were still engaged with the food, actively considering another bite. So a firm, deliberate placement on the rester across the bowl was key to the "I am content" message. Another technique involved using your chopsticks to interact with the food in ways that weren't about eating it. You might use one chopstick to gently push a piece of food around on your plate, examining it with exaggerated interest, as if marveling at its preparation or appearance, rather than getting ready to devour it. You could lift a piece, admire it briefly, perhaps even bring it close to your nose to inhale the aroma, and then with a small, satisfied sigh, place it back down. This demonstrated appreciation for the dish and the host's effort without actually reducing the amount of food consumed. It was the culinary equivalent of window shopping. Lots of looking, no buying or eating in this case. Think about holding a steaming dumpling with your chopsticks. If you were hungry, you'd likely bring it straight to your mouth. But if you were pretending to be full, you might hold it for a moment, admiring its perfect pleats, perhaps rotating it slightly, letting the steam curl around your fingers, then place it back on the plate with a regretful little gesture as if saying, "Oh, how I wish I had room for this masterpiece. But alas, I am utterly sated." Yeah, it requires a surprising amount of willpower to do this, by the way, especially when your stomach is staging that opera we mentioned earlier. The speed of your chewing, while not directly a chopstick technique, was intimately linked to their use. Placing a small amount of food in your mouth with your chopsticks and then chewing it very slowly made that single bite last. You might even pause with chopsticks, still holding the next potential bite midair, waiting for your mouth to finally finish its laborious task. This creates the visual impression that you are still actively eating, still progressing through the meal, but doing so at such a leisurely pace that you must surely be feeling the effects of fullness already. Historians have documented that in ancient China, particularly during the Tang and Song dynasties, dining etiquette became increasingly formalized, especially in official or scholarly circles. Detailed guides on proper conduct at banquets were written, outlining everything from seating arrangements to how to handle utensils. Chopsticks having become the primary eating implement for most dishes. By this time, spoons were still used, especially for soups and rice, but chopsticks gained prominence for solid foods, featured heavily in these rules. These guides often stressed grace, restraint, and consideration for others, providing a formal framework for the very behaviors that could be subtly exaggerated to signal fullness. This wasn't just improvisational acting. It was based on a recognized script of polite dining. A quirky tidbit involves the materials chopsticks were made from. While bamboo and wood were common, wealthier individuals might use ivory, jade, or even silver. Using chopsticks made of precious materials added another layer to the performance. You weren't just eating, you were handling a piece of art, a status symbol. The care taken with expensive chopsticks could easily be intertwined with the performance of polite, unhurried eating. Imagine using delicate ivory chopsticks to slowly pick at a single piece of ginger. It automatically looks less like you're shoveling food and more like you're a connoisseur savoring a rare delicacy, regardless of your actual hunger level. Some accounts even mention golden chopsticks, which sounds incredibly uncomfortable to hold for a long meal. But hey, fashion over function, right? Historians still argue whether the subtle chopstick cues were universally understood across all social strata, or if they were primarily a form of communication within the educated elite or merchant classes who were more likely to attend elaborate banquets described in historical texts. Did a peasant at a village feast use the same subtle signals as a scholar at the imperial court? Probably not with the same level of codified sophistication, but the basic principles of using eating implements to signal one's state of satisfaction likely trickled down, adapting to local customs. It's debated how much was formal rule versus informal social norm. Let's get back to your hands clutching those chopsticks. You might use them to point not at food you want, but at food you don't need more of. A polite gesture towards a full bowl or platter, accompanied by a slight shake of the head or a contented sigh, communicated your appreciation for that dish without taking more. It's like saying, "Your stir fry is magnificent. I am still basking in the glory of the portion I had earlier and simply couldn't do it justice by taking more right now." Consider the act of serving others, which was also done with chopsticks, often longer. Communal chopsticks provided for the serving dishes. You might make a show of politely serving a small portion to your neighbor or to the host, deflecting attention from your own plate and appearing helpful and engaged, all while avoiding the necessity of putting more food onto your own plate or into your own mouth. This was a common practice anyway, as sharing was central to the dining experience. But it could easily be used as a tactic to subtly shift the focus away from your own consumption or lack thereof. "Oh, allow me," you'd say, reaching for the communal chopsticks. "You simply must try this dish," while secretly thinking, "And while I'm busy serving you, I am blessedly not expected to be shoving food into my own face." The weight and feel of different types of chopsticks could even play a role. Heavy bronze or silver chopsticks felt different than light bamboo ones. The clinking sound they made against porcelain bowls provided a sonic backdrop to the meal. Imagine the subtle click as you deliberately set down your heavy bronze chopsticks, a sound that punctuated your declaration of, "I am finished." It was a more emphatic statement than the soft placement of lightweight bamboo. Sensory details like this weren't just background noise. They were part of the performance. Sometimes the trick was to use your chopsticks to create the appearance of effortful eating. You might meticulously pick apart a small piece of fish bone by bone, taking an inordinate amount of time, as if the complexity of the task was slowing you down rather than your feigned fullness. Or you could use them to carefully rearrange the food on your plate, pushing pieces around to create a neat but clearly unfinished pile, signaling that you had eaten but had reached your limit. It was all about managing the visual evidence. Another subtle maneuver, holding your chopsticks together in one hand, resting them vertically on the table, or on the chopstick rest while you use your other hand to cradle a teacup and sip slowly. This posture clearly indicated a pause in eating, giving you a reprieve and allowing you to focus on conversation or simply looking contemplative without the host prompting you to take more food. It was a nonverbal sign that you were on break from the serious business of consuming calories. This intricate dance with chopsticks wasn't just about individual performance, it was a form of mutual understanding. Hosts understood these signals, even if they chose to politely ignore them and offer more food anyway as part of their role. Guests understood the signals others were sending. It was a shared language of politeness and expectation management conducted with pointed sticks. The person most adept at this subtle communication was likely admired for their social grace and understanding of the nuances of interaction. So the next time you pick up a pair of chopsticks, remember their ancient history as tools, not just for sustenance, but for sophisticated social signaling. The simple act of putting them down or using them to point or slowing their movement to a crawl could be a performance honed over centuries to navigate the complex pressures of hospitality and hunger in a world where appearing full was sometimes as important as actually being so. You weren't just eating, you were directing a tiny play on the stage of your dinner plate with your chopsticks as the lead actors. So you've mastered the silent language of the chopsticks, the slow hover, the careful placement, the almost mournful return of a potential morsel to the plate. You've trained your face into a mask of serene sanity despite the internal clamor. But relying only on nonverbal cues is risky. A truly determined host, or perhaps just an oblivious one, might still pile your bowl high, mistaking your contemplative pace for mere shyness. This is where the next level of performance comes in, turning your mouth from an eating machine into a talking machine. Yes, one of the most effective ways to avoid putting food into your mouth is to keep your mouth busy saying things. The ancient Chinese banquet, especially among the educated elite or officials, wasn't just about consuming vast quantities of food and drink. It was a complex social arena, a place for networking, demonstrating wit, reciting poetry, engaging in philosophical debate, and solidifying relationships. Conversation wasn't just polite background noise. It was a central feature of the event. And for you, the aspiring master of feignfulness, it was your greatest ally. Think of it as a strategic diversion. While everyone else is focused on the succulent pork belly or the beautifully arranged fish, you pivot to the intellectual or the social. You become intensely interested in the host's recent travels, the political machinations at court, or the deeper meaning behind a classic poem someone just quoted. You ask questions, lots of them. Open-ended questions are best the kind that require long, detailed answers. Tell me more about your journey to the South. You might say, leaning in with an expression of profound fascination, your chopsticks completely still resting innocently across your bowl. I've always been curious about the landscape changes past the Yangtze. While your esteemed fellow guest launches into a lengthy description of mountains and rivers, you are granted a precious reprieve. Your eyes are fixed on theirs. Your head nods in agreement. You interject with thoughtful little sounds. Ah, truly or fascinating. All while your plate remains untouched, a silent monument to your supposed repletion. You are performing active listening with the intensity of a spy gathering intelligence, not because you necessarily care that much about provincial flora, but because every minute they talk is a minute you don't have to eat. You could also become the storyteller yourself. Perhaps you recount a humorous anecdote from your own life, a witty observation about human nature, or even a slightly embellished tale of a minor adventure. The key is to make your story engaging enough to capture attention, requiring dramatic pauses, changes in tone, maybe even a few hand gestures. Careful not to accidentally fling food with your enthusiastic gesticulations. That would ruin the sophisticated facade. As you spin your yarn, you are naturally not eating. Your hands are occupied with description, your mouth with speaking. You are the center of attention, but the attention is on your words, not the untouched state of your plate. This tactic worked particularly well in environments where intellectual prowess and rhetorical skill were highly valued. A scholar's banquet, for example, might feature impromptu poetry composition contests. If you could participate, or at least appear deeply engaged in the process, you had a perfect excuse to ignore the food. Forgive me, you might say, holding your chopsticks poised but inactive, I am simply reeling from the beauty of Master Li's last couplet. It requires quiet contemplation. Who could argue with such reverence for art? You weren't being rude, you were being intellectual. It's like claiming you can't eat because you're too busy appreciating the ambient lighting at a fancy restaurant. Entirely plausible if you say it with enough conviction. Feigning intense focus on others was another powerful technique. When someone else was speaking, especially the host or a guest of high status, you would make a show of giving them your complete, undivided attention. You'd turn your body towards them, maintain unwavering eye contact, and respond with eager questions or comments. This posture subtly communicates that the conversation is the most important thing happening right now, overshadowing the mere act of eating. You were prioritizing social engagement and intellectual exchange over basic consumption, a highly admirable trait in many historical contexts. Let's talk about the host's role. A good host in ancient China took pride in the abundance and quality of their feast, and a truly excellent host would actively encourage guests to eat their fill, often placing choice morsels directly into their bowls. This was where your conversational shield was absolutely vital. As the host reached for a serving spoon or communal chopsticks with that glint in their eye that said, "You look a little thin, have some more of this incredibly rich stew," you would pivot. Esteemed host, you'd interrupt gently though firmly. Before you trouble yourself, might I ask your opinion on the current administrative reforms in the capital? Your wisdom on such matters is unparalleled, and I confess I am quite perplexed by the implications for the provincial grain tax. Boom. Conversation deployed. The host, flattered by your appeal to their expertise and perhaps secretly relieved to show off their knowledge, would likely put down the serving spoon and launch into an explanation. While they were discoursing on bureaucracy, you were safe. Your plate remained a safe haven, a monument to your fake fullness. It was the ultimate conversational judo, using the host's own desire to appear wise and respected against their intention to force feed you. You had to be careful, though. Your conversation shouldn't be so absorbing that it genuinely brought the meal to a halt for everyone. You weren't trying to ruin the banquet. You were trying to navigate your own position within it. The goal was to create a bubble of intense conversational engagement around you, allowing others to continue eating while you were politely excused by the demands of dialogue. It was a subtle act of social negotiation. Historians note that during periods like the Tang Dynasty, 618-907, CE poetry composition at banquets became particularly popular among the literati. Gatherings at scenic locations, often involving significant amounts of alcohol, would frequently include challenges to compose poems on the spot using specific rhymes or themes. Engaging in this activity was a fantastic way to occupy your time and mind, placing the focus squarely on artistic expression rather than food consumption. Imagine the scene: someone presents a challenging theme and everyone falls silent for a few moments, appearing lost in thought. You, however, are not thinking about meter and rhyme. You are silently cheering that for the next 5, 10, maybe even 15 minutes, nobody expects you to touch your food. You could even make a show of contemplating deeply, perhaps gently tapping your chopsticks against your forehead, another subtle non-eating gesture lost in the muse's embrace. A quirky tidbit from historical accounts is the use of riddles or word games at banquets. These required sharp minds and quick wits, and participating was another excellent way to keep your mouth busy talking and your brain occupied with something other than the tantalizing aroma of slow-roasted duck. Imagine a guest posing a complex riddle. While others are pondering, you could jump in discussing potential answers, debating interpretations, or even posing a counter riddle. This transforms the table from a place of simple eating into a battlefield of intellect where your primary weapon is your voice, not your ability to wield chopsticks full of food. It was a way to elevate the meal beyond mere sustenance, framing it as a sophisticated gathering of minds. And conveniently, you couldn't really eat and engage in a rapid-fire exchange of complex riddles at the same time. Could you? Unless you were exceptionally talented at multitasking, which frankly sounds exhausting when you're already pretending to be full. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on conversation and intellectual pursuits at ancient Chinese banquets was a primary function that coincidentally provided cover for those wishing to eat less, or if the potential for using it as a strategic distraction from eating was a conscious element understood by the participants. Was it a genuine love for poetry and philosophy, or was it partly a cultural performance where demonstrating engagement in such activities was a polite way to signal sophistication and perhaps manage your plate size? It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. Did they talk a lot? They didn't have to eat as much, or did they just talk a lot? Anyway, and some people cleverly use that as an excuse. Let's return to your performance. Beyond asking questions or telling stories, you could also become the designated explainer or commentator on the food itself. You weren't eating it, mind you, but you were talking about it. The subtle hint of star anise in this dish is simply divine. You might declare, inhaling deeply and performatively over the untouched bowl. And the tenderness of the beef, the chef must have truly mastered the simmering technique, suksorm. This allowed you to participate in the appreciation of the meal, demonstrating your discerning palate and knowledge of cuisine without actually having to consume it. You were engaging with the idea of the food, the art of it, rather than the physical reality of needing to shovel it into your stomach. It's like being a food critic who only writes reviews based on smells and appearances. You could also use conversation to manage pace. By launching into a story or a detailed question, just as a new dish arrived, you could delay the moment when it was expected that you would try it. By the time your conversation wrapped up, others might have already sampled it, reducing the social pressure on you to immediately dive in. You could then take just a minuscule portion, or perhaps politely decline, claiming you were still contemplating the nuances of the previous course, the one you also didn't eat much of. Another trick involved using conversational pauses strategically. When there was a lull in the general chatter, instead of reaching for food, you might use that moment to ask a question specifically directed at the person sitting furthest away, forcing a brief break in everyone's eating as they turn to listen to the question and the answer. It was a subtle way to interrupt the rhythm of consumption and redirect the collective focus, even if only for a moment. Every little bit helps when you're trying to survive a feast on willpower and witty banter. Remember, the goal is not just to avoid eating, but to do so gracefully and without drawing undue negative attention. You want to appear engaged, appreciative, and appropriately social. By becoming a lively conversationalist, you position yourself as a valuable guest, contributing to the atmosphere and enjoyment of the banquet through your wit and words, making your lighter eating almost unnoticeable amidst your vibrant presence. Oh, never mind his plate. Someone might think, just listen to his hilarious story about the runaway donkey. Your verbal performance became the main event, overshadowing the less impressive performance happening on your plate. So the next time you find yourself in a situation with too much food and too much pressure to eat, remember your ancient counterparts. Put down the metaphorical chopsticks, open your mouth not to eat but to speak. Ask questions, tell stories, wax poetic about the historical significance of the teacup in your hand. Become the master of the conversational shield, deflecting calories with commentary and turning your polite refusal into a demonstration of intellectual or social grace. In the intricate dance of the ancient Chinese banquet, sometimes the best way to appear full was simply to keep talking. You've charmed them with your wit, dazzled them with your knowledge of provincial grain taxes, and perhaps even composed a passable couplet about the moonlight reflecting on the host's incredibly full-looking fish dish. Your mouth, previously a gateway for sustenance, has become a barricade of clever words and polite inquiries. But even the most engaging conversationalist cannot talk forever without someone eventually noticing that the glorious spread before you seems remarkably untouched. The conversation shield was effective for delaying the inevitable, for diverting attention during critical moments like the arrival of a particularly rich course or a host bearing a heaping serving spoon. But now you must confront the physical evidence of your deceit, your plate, or more likely, your collection of bowls and dishes. In the intricate theater of the ancient Chinese banquet, leaving your food completely undisturbed was akin to forgetting your lines on stage. It didn't just signal a lack of appetite. It could be interpreted as disrespect for the host, their generosity, and the effort put into preparing the meal. It suggested either that the food was bad, an insult, or that you were too arrogant or unwell to partake properly. Neither was a good look. Thus, even as you swore internally that not another morsel would pass your lips, you had to engage in the delicate art of plate management. This wasn't about actually eating, mind you. This was about making it look like you had eaten. It was a form of culinary camouflage, a subtle performance designed to convey a false sense of progress. Your chopsticks, previously wielded for dramatic pauses or pointing during storytelling, now became tools of deception. First, there was the strategic rearrangement. Imagine your bowl of rice. You've taken the polite initial scoop, maybe two. Now the rice sits there, a white flag of surrender. To make it appear like you've consumed more, you gently, almost unconsciously, move the rice around with your chopsticks. You create little valleys and peaks, pushing the grains towards the edges of the bowl. It looks less like a pristine, untouched mound, and more like a landscape that has been explored, traversed its geography, altered by interaction. You weren't eating it. You were conducting edible cartography. The same applied to other dishes. If there was a shared platter of vegetables or meat and you had reluctantly taken a small portion onto your personal dish, you wouldn't just leave it in a neat pile. You'd subtly break it apart, maybe push a piece of pork belly to the side, separate a vegetable from the main clump. You were performing the actions of someone who had been eating, dissecting, considering, moving things around, without the inconvenient consequence of actual consumption. It's like emptying a bag of chips into a bowl and then just poking them with a finger. It looks like someone's been at them, even if you haven't ingested a single chip. Sauces were your friend here. A little bit of sauce smeared across a plate, a few stray grains of rice clinging to the edge of a bowl. These were the visual cues of a meal in progress or a meal recently completed. You might swirl a sauce around with a chopstick tip, making it look like you were mixing or preparing a bite, but never actually lifting it to your mouth. It was like abstract expressionism, but with soy sauce and regrettable decisions about portion size. Then there was the absolute necessity of the acknowledgement bite. You simply had to sample most, if not all, of the dishes presented to you, especially the newer ones. But a sample didn't mean a full, satisfying mouthful. Oh no, a sample was the absolute minimum required to avoid offending your host. This required exquisite chopstick control. You'd pick up the tiniest piece of meat, the smallest sliver of duck, the most negligible fragment of fish, or for something like vegetables, just a single leaf or strand. You'd bring it slowly towards your mouth, a performative journey across the gulf between plate and lips. You'd place it in your mouth, chew with deliberate, thoughtful slowness, allowing precious seconds to tick by, nod slightly, perhaps utter a quiet or excellent, and then swallow with practiced nonchalance. This was culinary theater at its finest. The bite was so small, its caloric impact negligible, but its social impact immense. You had fulfilled your duty. You had acknowledged the dish. You had shown respect for the chef's skills. And now, having tasted it, you could more easily avoid taking a larger portion later. "Oh, this is truly superb," you'd say, gesturing vaguely at the platter after your minuscule bite. "I just savored a piece, and the flavors are so complex." Translation: tried it, done with it, don't try and make me have more. For dishes like soup or broth, the acknowledgement sip was crucial. You'd lift the bowl if it was a small personal one, or use the ceramic spoon, taking just the tiniest amount, letting it linger on your tongue for a moment, and then swallowing deliberately. Again, a performative act of appreciation and consumption designed to signal that you had engaged with the dish, even if you had barely made a dent in the actual volume. It's the historical equivalent of taking one single M&M from a bowl and then proudly declaring you've had dessert. Beyond the active manipulation of food on the plate, there were rituals specifically designed to signal satiety. One of the most universally understood signals in ancient East Asian cultures was the placement of your chopsticks. When you were finished eating or wished to indicate you were done with a particular dish, or even the meal itself, you would place your chopsticks neatly across the top of your bowl. Never ever stick them upright in the rice. That was highly taboo, resembling incense sticks offered to the dead. But placing them horizontally, resting across the rim of your bowl, was a widely recognized way of saying, "I have finished," or at least, "I am pausing indefinitely," and by indefinitely, I mean forever if possible. A host observing this cue would understand that you were likely finished, or at least not actively seeking more food from that specific bowl. It was a quiet, non-verbal declaration of, "No thank you, I am full." You would do this for each bowl as you finished, with it creating a subtle growing collection of diagonally crossed chopsticks around your eating area. Each pair of chopsticks was a little flag of victory in your personal battle against overconsumption. Interestingly, leaving a small amount of food on your plate or in your bowl could also be a signal of fullness, particularly among the wealthy. In some periods in social circles, clearing your plate entirely might suggest that the host hadn't provided enough food, implying you were still hungry. Conversely, leaving just a little bit demonstrated that the host's generosity was so immense, their spread so abundant, that you, the guest, were completely satisfied and simply couldn't manage another bite. It was a delicate balance. Too much left behind was wasteful and rude, but a pristine, scraped-clean plate could also be misinterpreted. You aimed for that sweet spot, a plate that showed signs of activity, maybe a few disregarded scraps or a final tablespoon of rice, but was far from empty. It showed you had partaken, but had been overwhelmed by the sheer bounty. It's like leaving one solitary French fry in the carton. You definitely ate some, but you couldn't possibly finish the whole monstrous portion. Physical gestures also played a role, though perhaps more subtly. Leaning back slightly in your seat, placing your hands on your lap rather than near your bowl, a slow, contented, and performed sigh. These could all contribute to the illusion of repletion. Patting one's stomach might have been a bit too gauche for polite society, but a hand resting gently on the belly could signal comfort and fullness. You needed to exude an air of someone who had just enjoyed a magnificent filling meal, even if your stomach was staging a protest. Historians note that dining etiquette, including these subtle signals of satiety, became increasingly complex and formalized during later imperial dynasties, such as the Ming and Qing. Detailed guides on proper conduct at banquets were written outlining everything from how to hold your chopsticks to the appropriate way to decline drink offers. This formalization suggests that navigating the social pressures of eating was a significant aspect of upper-class life, making these tricks not just personal strategies, but perhaps part of a recognized social code. It wasn't just you trying to get out of eating. It was part of the elaborate dance of politeness and status display. A quirky tidbit is the occasional mention of specific foods being served last because they were considered definitive ending foods, perhaps a light broth or a specific type of sweet pastry. The arrival of this final dish acted as a collective signal that the main eating portion of the meal was over, making it easier for guests to decline further servings of the heavier dishes that preceded it. If you could just hold out until the ending food arrived, your battle was almost won. It's like waiting for the cake to be cut at a party. Once that happens, it's socially acceptable to stop hovering around the savory snacks. Historians still argue whether the specific amount of food left on a plate was a conscious signal of the host's generosity or simply a practical outcome of overserving coupled with polite attempts to eat as much as possible. Was it a deliberate performance? See, host your bounty is so great, I cannot finish, or just the inevitable result of societal pressure leading to waste? It's hard to know the true intent behind every half-eaten bowl from centuries ago. Let's circle back to your current predicament, surrounded by delicious but overwhelming food. You've talked a good game now. You're working on your plate. You select a piece of beautifully braised mushroom, bringing it towards your mouth. You pause, admiring it. The aroma, you exclaim quietly to a neighbor, delaying the inevitable. You take the tiny bite, chew, slowly perhaps, with a slight squint of concentration to show you're really focusing on the flavor. Remarkable. You state, placing your chopsticks down on the table for a moment of performative reflection. Then you pick them up again, not to take another bite, but to subtly push the remaining mushrooms around in their bowl. You might also use your chopsticks to examine the food rather than eat it. Lifting a piece of fish, turning it over to look at the bone structure, commenting on the cooking technique, all while consuming none of it. You were like a culinary detective, meticulously inspecting the evidence of the meal without needing to ingest it. Ah, the way the meat flakes from the bone here. Truly a sign of perfect steaming. You might muse aloud, gently poking the fish with a chopstick. This constant, subtle manipulation of the food on your plate, combined with the occasional, minuscule acknowledgement bite and the strategic deployment of crossed chopsticks, created a powerful illusion. To the casual observer, you were a guest partaking in the feast, enjoying the different dishes progressing through the meal at a respectable pace. Only you knew the truth. You were a master illusionist, a performance artist whose stage was the banquet table and whose prop was the food you weren't eating. The success of these tactics relied heavily on your ability to perform them naturally without drawing attention to your lack of actual consumption. It required practice, observation, and an understanding of the subtle social cues of the banquet. You weren't just moving food, you were crafting a narrative on your plate, a story of satisfied indulgence, one strategically placed chopstick at a time. And as the meal wore on and other guests genuinely began to slow down, your feigned repletion became increasingly indistinguishable from genuine fullness. Your carefully arranged plate, your strategically placed chopsticks, your contented sighs, they all converged into a convincing portrait of a guest who had eaten their fill and was now merely enjoying the company and the lingering tastes, even if those tastes were from 3 courses ago and amounted to a single pea and a sliver of ginger. So remember, while conversation gets you far, the state of your plate tells the final story. Master the art of edible camouflage, the minimal acknowledgement bite, and the powerful silent language of the crossed chopsticks. In the subtle world of ancient Chinese banquets, sometimes the most convincing performance of fullness happened not in your stomach, but right there in plain sight on your plate. So you've mastered the art of plate manipulation, turning your half-full bowl into a convincing diorama of a hearty meal, and your chopsticks lie strategically across your bowl like tired sentinels guarding the gates of plenty. You've sighed contentedly, leaned back slightly, maybe even patted your belly with practiced subtlety. You feel a sense of triumph. Surely now everyone understands you are utterly, magnificently full. You've presented the visual evidence. The prosecution rests its case. But the ancient Chinese banquet, ever a test of endurance and social agility, wasn't finished with you yet. Merely looking full wasn't always enough. The truly skilled host, guided by millennia of tradition, emphasizing generosity and ensuring guest satisfaction, often interpreted as guests eating until they physically cannot move, might still press you. They see your beautifully arranged plate, your crossed chopsticks, your serene expression of repletion, and their mind doesn't think, a guest well-fed and content. It thinks, perhaps they are merely being polite. I must insist they have more. This is where the performance shifts from passive visual cues to active verbal and nonverbal refusal. And let me tell you, refusing an insistent host in this context was a delicate dance, a polite wrestling match where the loser ended up having to eat more sweet potato and pork fat than they ever thought possible. It wasn't a simple no thank you. That could come across as abrupt, ungrateful, even insulting. It implied either that the food wasn't worth eating more of, or that the host's offering wasn't sufficiently compelling to overcome your, perhaps feigned, lack of appetite. The core principle of polite refusal was to attribute your inability to eat more, not to a lack of desire or the quality of the food, but to your own physical limitations caused by the host's incredible generosity and the food's exquisite deliciousness. You had to make your refusal sound like a compliment wrapped in a tragic confession of a stomach simply too small to contain such bounty. Imagine the scene. The host, or perhaps a diligent servant, approaches your seating area, holding a spoon poised over a steaming platter of something fragrant and rich. Maybe braised fish with ginger and scallions, a dish you know you absolutely cannot face right now without triggering some kind of internal revolt. Their eyes meet yours, a smile on their face, ready to scoop. Your carefully constructed facade of fullness suddenly feels very fragile. Your immediate reaction must be a warm smile, perhaps a slight bow of acknowledgement. Before they even finish offering, you must convey gratitude first. Esteemed host, the fish looks utterly divine. You might begin your voice gentle and appreciative. This preemptive compliment softens the blow of the refusal to come. Then comes the crucial part. You might gently raise a hand palm, slightly outwards, a subtle gesture of polite deferral. Verbally, the phrases are key. You wouldn't say, "No, I don't want any more." Far too blunt. Instead, you might say something like, "Oh, esteemed host, your generosity overwhelms me. Every dish tonight has been so spectacular, so abundant, that I am already completely delightfully full." Notice the emphasis: generosity, spectacular dishes, abundance. These are the reasons you are full. Your fullness is a result of their excellence, not a rejection of it. It's like telling someone their gift was so amazing you cried so much you're now dehydrated and can't speak. It's a convoluted way of saying you can't talk, but it sounds like it's because of their awesomeness. Another common tactic was to describe your fullness in vivid, even slightly exaggerated terms. My stomach feels ready to burst with the sheer pleasure of your feast. You might declare, perhaps placing a hand dramatically, but not too dramatically, over your abdomen. If I were to eat another single grain of rice, I fear I might simply dissolve into a puddle of contentment. Okay, maybe not dissolve, but you get the idea. The language was often flowery, hyperbolic, designed to paint a picture of a guest physically incapacitated by the sheer volume and deliciousness of the food consumed. You could also use your previous feigned consumption as evidence. Having already savored that magnificent duck and the exquisite stir-fried greens, my poor stomach is protesting any further delights, no matter how tempting. You call back to the dishes you minimally sampled, giving the impression you engage with them fully. It's like saying, "I've already climbed Everest and explored the Marianas Trench today. I'm afraid I just don't have the energy to walk to the mailbox." Your previous minimal efforts are cited as the reason for your current absolute inability. The timing of the refusal was also important. You didn't want to refuse too quickly. That could seem dismissive. You allowed the offer to be fully made, perhaps even leaning forward slightly, as if considering it with great seriousness, before launching into your polite, effusive refusal. It was a performance of thoughtful consideration, followed by regretful physical inability. Nonverbal cues reinforced the verbal performance. The gentle wave of the hand, as mentioned, shaking your head slowly, a soft, regretful expression on your face, placing your hand over your empty or strategically full-looking bowl, as the host approached a silent shield against further offerings. Maintaining eye contact and smiling warmly throughout the refusal was crucial. It showed you weren't sullen or unappreciative, merely defeated by their generosity. What about drinks? Refusing drink, especially alcohol, could be even more complex, tied deeply into rituals of toasting camaraderie and social bonding. In many banquets, particularly those among men or for specific celebrations, drinking together was as significant as eating. Refusing a toast or a refill could be seen as breaking solidarity, implying distrust, or suggesting you didn't wish to fully participate in the social glue of the event. Again, direct refusal was difficult. You couldn't simply say, "No thanks, I don't feel like drinking." Excuses were necessary. Common ones included citing poor health. "My stomach is a bit delicate today," or "I have a recurring ailment that prevents me from fully enjoying such fine spirits." You might claim you had important business requiring a clear head the next morning, though this could sometimes imply the other guests didn't have important business, so use with caution. You could also claim you were simply a lightweight, a polite confession of weakness that excused you from keeping up with heavier drinkers. "Ah, esteemed host, your wine is so potent and delicious, even a single cup leaves me feeling quite merry. I must be careful not to disgrace myself." This frames your inability as a reaction to the quality of the drink, not a rejection of the act of drinking with others. There were also specific nonverbal cues for drink. When someone poured you wine or tea, a common gesture of thanks was to lightly tap 2 or 3 fingers on the table near your cup. This originated as a kowtow gesture, bowing your head to the ground, performed by servants in disguise who couldn't fully bow in public. The finger taps symbolized knocking their head. Over time, it became a general sign of thanks and acknowledgement when a drink was poured for you. You could also use this gesture, perhaps coupled with a verbal refusal, to acknowledge the offer of a refill and thank the person while simultaneously indicating you didn't need more. You're saying thank you for offering non-verbally, even as you verbally say, "No more, please." If you had to take a drink, particularly in a toast, you would like the acknowledgement bite, take the smallest possible sip. Raise the cup, make eye contact, offer a blessing or polite phrase. Bring the cup to your lips and take just enough to be polite. You might then set the cup down and subtly avoid picking it up again until absolutely necessary. Leaving a tiny amount of liquid in your cup was also sometimes permissible, a quiet signal of satisfaction or inability to finish, similar to leaving a bit of food. Historians note that the formality and rigidity of these refusal protocols varied greatly depending on the social context, the era, and the specific relationships between the host and guests. Banquets among close friends or family might allow for more relaxed refusals, while formal gatherings with superiors or important dignitaries demanded strict adherence to these elaborate displays of politeness. This suggests these weren't just personal strategies, but deeply ingrained cultural norms governing social hierarchy and interaction. A quirky tidbit is the practice in some regions of leaving one's cup completely empty after a toast as a sign of respect and commitment, while in others, leaving a little could signal appreciation for the limitless nature of the host's hospitality. It's a fascinating contradiction, highlighting the regional variations in etiquette. Imagine the stress. You're just trying to avoid getting tipsy, and suddenly you have to decipher whether emptying the cup means you're being rude by implying the host didn't give you were we enough, or rude by not fully participating. It makes choosing the right emoji to end a text message seem simple. Historians still argue whether the elaborate nature of these refusal rituals was primarily about genuine politeness and gratitude, or if they served a more strategic purpose, perhaps allowing guests to maintain a certain air of refinement by not appearing overly gluttonous, or even as a way to subtly assert status by demonstrating their control and moderation amidst abundance. Was it truly about not wanting to cause offense, or was it about performing a certain image of oneself? It's hard to know the true motivations behind every carefully worded refusal from centuries past. Let's return to your situation. The host is still smiling, the serving spoon hovering over the fish. You take a deep breath, channel your inner theatrical performer, and launch your defense. "Ah, esteemed host." You begin smiling warmly, raising your hand slightly. "This fish, I assure you, smells like a dream. I just finished savoring that absolutely perfect pork dish. And before that, the greens. Every bite has been such a profound pleasure. that my poor stomach is now staging a full-scale protest against receiving any more delightful visitors. You might even let out a quiet, performed sigh of contentment, not exhaustion. Truly, your hospitality is boundless, and my capacity, alas, is not. You hold a smile, maintaining eye contact, projecting sincerity and gratitude. You might even slightly rub your already full-looking belly. The host pauses, considers your heartfelt and hopefully convincing plea. If they are truly skilled, they will accept your refusal gracefully, perhaps moving on to offer the fish to the next guest. If they are particularly insistent, they might offer a very small portion, which you would then be obliged to take the dreaded second acknowledgement bite, and of course, subtly manage on your plate later. These polite refusals, delivered with charm and conviction, were just as important as managing your plate. They were your verbal barricades, your social force field against the relentless pressure of ancient Chinese hospitality. You were navigating a minefield of potential faux pas where a single misstep could turn a pleasant evening into an awkward display of either appearing ungrateful or worse, having to eat more when you were already praying for mercy. So remember, the key: deflect blame from the food or the host, place it squarely on your own temporary, caused by their excellence, physical limitations. Be effusive in your praise as you refuse. Use gentle gestures, and for drinks, master the finger tap and have your list of plausible and polite excuses ready. By combining impeccable plate management with gracious, convincing refusals, you could navigate the ancient banquet, appearing to partake heartily while secretly preserving the integrity of your waistband and your digestive system. It was an exhausting performance, yes, but a necessary one for survival and comfort in a world where being full was less about how you felt and more about what you could convincingly perform. So you've successfully navigated the treacherous waters of verbal refusal, pairing the host's insistent generosity with heartfelt compliments and dramatic declarations of stomach capacity limits. You've dodged the extra ladleful of braised pork, artfully deflected the offer of more steamed buns, and perhaps even managed to escape a potentially crippling round of toast by citing a sudden convenient susceptibility to fermented rice wine. You breathe a small internal sigh of relief. The pressure's off, right? You've politely said no, they've accepted it, and now you can just sit here, look vaguely content, and wait for this gastronomic marathon to mercifully end. Ah, if only it were that simple. Remember that acknowledgement bite you had to take? Or the small portion the host insisted upon despite your eloquent pleas? Or perhaps there are just some dishes on the vast table that frankly look questionable. Maybe it's something featuring sea cucumber, which has a texture you find deeply unsettling, or a soup that smells vaguely of disappointment and ancient river muck. Whatever the reason, you now face a new challenge, a quiet, intensely personal battle, fought entirely on the porcelain surface before you played camouflage. Your plate, my friend, is not just a vessel for food. It is your canvas, your battlefield, your theater stage. It must tell a story to anyone casually glancing at it. A story of a guest who has enthusiastically participated, who has sampled generously, and whose current state of relative fullness is the result of this vigorous engagement, not a lack of appreciation. It must not tell the story of someone who has merely pushed food around, who has left large, incriminating piles of untouched delicacies, that in the silent language of the banquet hall could scream ungrateful or picky, or worst of all, I did not enjoy your meticulously prepared squirrel brain soup. The goal of plate camouflage is simple: make the uneaten look eaten, or at least make it look like it's about what to be eaten, or like it's been temporarily set aside in the heat of the moment. You need to create the illusion of activity of consumption without actually consuming. This requires subtlety, tactical thinking, and perhaps a tiny bit of artistic flair. Your primary tool besides your cunning mind remains your chopsticks. These are no longer mere eating implements. They are excavators, rearrangers, and props. You can use them to gently, almost imperceptibly shift food around. The most basic technique is the circular migration. You push food from one side of the plate to the other, creating a shallow trench that looks vaguely like you scoop something out. Then you push it back. Repeat. It looks like you're actively engaging with the food, perhaps deciding which perfect piece to select, when in reality you're just playing culinary solitaire. More advanced techniques involve strategic layering and hiding. Got a pile of those suspiciously slimy mushrooms you absolutely cannot stomach? Look around. Is there a mound of fluffy rice nearby? Or perhaps a serving of stir-fried greens with larger leaves? Gently, oh so gently, maneuver the offending fungi under the rice mound. Tuck them beneath a cluster of cabbage leaves. Use a sturdy piece of meat, like a chunk of braised pork belly, to strategically screen a forbidden pile of pickled vegetables from view. It's like hiding your report card under a pile of laundry, out of immediate sight but still technically there. Bones are your friends. At a typical ancient Chinese banquet, bones from fish, chicken, or other meats were common. Instead of placing them neatly aside, which might signal you've finished, that dish you can subtly arrange them on your plate in a way that creates visual clutter. A few scattered bones can make it look like you've worked your way through a substantial portion of meat. Even better, place a few larger bones near the edge of your plate and then use them to strategically obscure a pile of untouched vegetables behind them. It's a bone curtain, a savory screen against prying eyes. Creating the illusion of a worked-on plate also involves disrupting the initial presentation. When a dish is served, it often has a certain aesthetic arrangement. You need to mess that up, but tastefully. Poke at things with your chopsticks. Separate components. Break a piece of fish apart, even if you don't eat it. Scatter a few grains of rice. Make it look like the plate has been visited, explored, and engaged with. A pristine, untouched portion of food stands out like a sore thumb. A slightly disheveled, strategically rearranged portion suggests you've been busy. Consider the sauces and oils. Many dishes are served with rich sauces or are quite oily. You can use this to your advantage. If you've taken a piece of meat you don't plan to eat, subtly drag it through a sauce, leaving a trail on your plate. This creates visual evidence of interaction. You can also use your chopsticks to swirl the sauce around slightly, making it look like you were mixing things or scooping. It's abstract art for the purposes of social survival. What about the dreaded acknowledgement bite? If you were forced to take a piece of something truly unpalatable, the challenge is even greater. You can't just leave it whole. You might have to perform a pantomime of eating it. Break it into smaller pieces. Chew slowly, perhaps keeping the piece towards the front of your mouth where you can manage it. If you absolutely cannot swallow it, the historical texts are less clear on the polite disposal methods for regurgitated squirrel brain. Let's hope you never face that particular dilemma, and that your plate camouflage is effective enough to avoid the need for a second bite entirely. Historians note that while the exact layout in specific dishes varied by region, social class, and the purpose of the gathering, a wedding banquet was different from a scholarly meeting feast. The general principles of communal dining and demonstrating appreciation through consumption were fairly universal across ancient China. Banquets often involved numerous courses, sometimes dozens served sequentially or all at once on large tables. You were expected to take from communal platters onto your individual bowl or plate. Common staples included rice or noodles in the north, various preparations of pork, chicken, duckfish, and a wide array of vegetables, often stir-fried, steamed, or stewed. A quirky tidbit about ancient Chinese dining practices concerns the serving order. While modern multi-course meals often move from lighter fare to heavier or savory to sweet, some ancient banquets had less rigid structures with different types of dishes appearing throughout the meal. Also, unlike some other cultures where communal dishes might be passed around, often servants would bring platters to each guest, allowing them to take portions directly. This could add pressure, as the servant was a direct witness to whether you took a serving and how much was left on your plate later. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on appearing full and managing one's plate was solely a matter of not offending the host, or if it also related to deeper philosophical concepts of moderation, control, and the performance of social harmony. Was it simply good manners or a subtle display of self-discipline and respect for the abundance provided by a benevolent host, and perhaps implicitly a benevolent ruler, or heaven? It's a fascinating puzzle of social performance versus genuine feeling. Let's put these camouflage tactics into practice. That pile of questionable green stuff looks a bit like pond scum stir-fried with regret, is sitting prominently on your plate. You glance casually around. Nobody seems to be paying too much attention to your specific plate at this exact moment. Good. With your chopsticks, you gently nudge the pile towards the edge near where you've artfully placed a couple of chicken bones. You then scoop a little rice, which you've actually eaten some of, thank goodness, and push it slightly over the edge of the green pile, creating a small embankment. Next, you pick up a piece of pork, another item you've successfully consumed, and place it partially over the green stuff, as if you were about to eat the pork and just temporarily set it there. You might then use your chopsticks to pick up a single grain of rice from another part of your plate and bring it towards your mouth, creating the impression of eating, even if you just nibble that one grain. All these small movements, these subtle rearrangements contribute to the narrative your plate is telling. This person is actively eating and managing their food. You are creating visual noise distractions that prevent a quick glance from revealing the untouched treasures lurking beneath the surface. The napkin trick, while potentially risky, depending on the formality of the setting and the availability of napkins, which weren't always like the paper or cloth napkins we use today. Sometimes it was just a small cloth or towel was a desperate measure. If you had a small portable cloth, provided you might, in theory, be able to subtly wrap a small, unmanageable piece of food in it and place it in your sleeve or pocket. However, this carried a high risk of being seen and was likely only attempted by the truly desperate or those in less formal settings. It's probably safer to focus on rearranging and hiding on the plate itself. Creating the illusion of a cleared plate was the ultimate goal for some, but often unnecessary and potentially suspicious. A completely empty plate too early might suggest you didn't get enough or that the servings were too small. Another subtle insult to the host's generosity. The ideal state was a plate that looked worked on, maybe some scraps, some scattered remnants, a few bones and spaces where food used to be, even if those spaces were created by pushing everything else around. It needed to look like you could eat more theoretically, but had reached a natural point of pause or repletion due to the sheer volume already consumed. This constant management of your plate, the silent dance of the chopsticks, the strategic placement of bones and rice, the careful layering, it was exhausting work requiring vigilance throughout the entire banquet. You couldn't just relax after your eloquent refusal. You had to maintain the illusion on your plate. It was a multi-layered performance, a delicate balancing act between appearing appreciative and participating while secretly ensuring you didn't overconsume, or worse, have to eat something truly dreadful. And remember, it wasn't just about your plate. You also had to be aware of the communal serving dishes. Taking the last piece of a popular dish might be seen as greedy, while never taking from certain dishes might be seen as rude. Navigating the serving platters themselves required another layer of subtle social maneuvering, but that's a story for another time. For now, focus on your immediate environment, your porcelain stage. With practice, you could become a master of plate camouflage, a culinary illusionist, leaving the banquet hall with your dignity and your digestive system intact, having successfully convinced everyone that you ate like a king, even if you only truly consumed a few strategic bites and a lot of air. So you've carefully sculpted your plate into a masterpiece of deception, a visual narrative of enthusiastic consumption, where very little actual consuming has occurred. You've layered, you've tucked, you've artfully arranged bones like abstract sculptures, all to create the illusion that you are deep in the throes of a magnificent feast. But just arranging the food isn't enough. A truly convincing performance requires more than just a pretty or strategically messy plate. You also have to look like you're eating. This is where the techniques move from the passive manipulation of objects to the active theatrical performance of ingestion. Welcome to the subtle art of the simulated swallow, the phantom bite, and the fake chew. Skills that could honestly earn you an honorary degree in ancient Chinese banquet drama. The host or perhaps another attentive guest might catch your eye. They smile, gesture towards a dish, or even ask how you're finding the meal. You can't just nod placidly over a strategically rearranged plate. You need to be seen, engaging with the food in a way that confirms your simulated satiety is the happy outcome of your efforts, not a pre-existing condition. The primary tool here is your mouth, not for tasting or nourishing, but for performing. You pick up a small piece of food, ideally something relatively innocuous, but if you're trapped, perhaps even a sliver of that dreaded fermented something or other. The key is small. The smaller the piece, the less of a problem it becomes later. You bring it to your mouth with your chopsticks. This is your opening act. Make eye contact, maybe offer a slight appreciative nod as the food approaches your lips. Convey anticipation, pleasure. Now the food is in your mouth. This is where the real performance begins. You need to simulate chewing. Close your lips gently, not tightly like you're guarding a state secret, but naturally. Move your jaw in a rhythmic motion, not too fast, not too slow. Think contented cow, not frantic squirrel. The goal is to look like you are breaking down the food, extracting its flavor, preparing it for swallowing. But you are not swallowing. Absolutely not. The food item, if it's something truly offensive or if your stomach is genuinely protesting, needs to remain in your mouth, a tiny unwelcome guest at the party. This requires considerable control. Your tongue becomes your co-conspirator. It must gently maneuver the food item, preventing it from migrating too far back in your throat, where a spontaneous gag reflex might blow your cover. It also needs to manage saliva production. Too much saliva, and you risk looking like you're struggling or worse, needing to discreetly expectorate. Too little, and your mouth might feel dry, making the act of simulated chewing less convincing. You maintain the chewing motion. Perhaps you punctuate it with small, thoughtful pauses, as if savoring the flavor. You might even close your eyes for a second, leaning back slightly, a picture of gustatory bliss. Ah, your body language says the subtle notes of, well, whatever this is, truly exquisite. Meanwhile, the small, unwanted morsel is being gently nudged and rotated by your tongue, a tiny captive on your oral stage. What do you do with it ultimately? This is the ultimate challenge of the fake chew. Swallowing is not an option if you are genuinely trying to avoid consuming more. Discreetly spitting it out is incredibly risky in a formal setting. Dropping it back onto your plate is possible, but you have to do it at the right moment, perhaps while reaching for a cup of tea or gesturing with your other hand, hoping it blends in with the existing plate camouflage. Some particularly daring or desperate individuals might try to subtly spit it into a napkin if one is available, or even into their sleeve, though both of these methods carry a high risk of exposure and social ruin. Imagine the horror the esteemed host notices a suspicious damp spot on your elegant silk sleeve, or a half-chewed piece of braised donkey intestine slips out onto the floor. Humiliation doesn't even begin to cover it. So the preferred method, though deeply uncomfortable, was often to hold the food item in your mouth for as long as possible, hoping an opportunity would arise to discard it unnoticed, or praying that the meal would end before you had to make a difficult decision. This is where that strategically placed teacup comes in handy. You can pretend to take a long, refreshing sip using the cup to shield your mouth from view for a moment. In that shielded instant, perhaps, you can subtly deposit the offending item back onto your plate, or even, in a moment of true desperation, into the tea itself, hoping it dissolves or sinks unnoticed. Don't try that at home, kids, or anywhere really. The key to making the fake chew believable is to combine it with other performance elements. A satisfied sigh after your simulated chew, a slight smile, a gesture towards the dish the item came from, perhaps saying something like, "This is truly wonderful, host," while the wonderful item is still sitting on your tongue. You are acting. You are performing appreciation and satiety simultaneously. It's like being in a play where the props are edible theoretically, and the audience is constantly judging your performance based on how much you appear to enjoy them. Think of the subtle cues that indicate someone is enjoying food, the way their eyes might widen slightly, the slight smacking of lips, the contented expression. You need to replicate these. Practice in the mirror if you must, though probably not right before the banquet. That might look weird. Learn to convey pleasure without the actual sensory input of taste or the physical act of swallowing. It's a masterclass in nonverbal communication and controlled deception. Historians note that ancient Chinese banquets, particularly for the elite, were highly ritualized events with specific seating arrangements, serving protocols and expectations of guest behavior. The sheer number of dishes served could be astonishing, far exceeding what any one person could reasonably consume. For example, during the Tang Dynasty, 618 and 907 CE, lavish banquets for officials or foreign dignitaries could feature dozens, even 100 or more different courses presented over several hours. This scale of abundance inherently created situations where guests are had to manage their consumption, making these pretending techniques less about outright dishonesty and more about navigating social expectations surrounding wealth, generosity, and politeness in the face of overwhelming plenty. A quirky tidbit related to this is the concept of food as a performance. Beyond just eating, guests might be expected to comment eloquently on the dishes, perhaps even composing impromptu poetry about their flavor or presentation. This further emphasized that the banquet was not just about sustenance, but a multifaceted social and cultural event where every action, including how you interacted with the food, carried meaning. Failing to engage with a dish, even through simulated means, could be seen as a failure to participate fully in the social ritual. Historians still argue whether the elaborate politeness rituals surrounding food consumption, including the pressure to appear fully satisfied, were primarily driven by genuine concern for the host's feelings, or if they were a form of social signaling, a way for guests to subtly display their own refinement, self-control, and understanding of etiquette within the hierarchical structure of ancient Chinese society. Was it about sparing the host embarrassment, or was it about demonstrating one's own status and mastery of complex social codes? It's a fascinating debate about the layers of meaning embedded in what might seem like simple table manners. The fake chew technique also extended to managing drinks, particularly alcohol. While the initial refusal might buy you some time, toasts were an integral part of many banquets, and refusing to drink with the host or other guests could be seen as deeply insulting. If you absolutely couldn't stomach the wine, perhaps it was potent rice wine, baijiu, which can be challenging, you might employ a similar tactic. Bring the cup to your lips, simulate swallowing, perhaps even make a motion as if clearing your throat afterwards, but in reality, very little or none of the liquid actually went down. This was even harder than with solid food, as liquids are less cooperative in the mouth. Some might discreetly pour a little out when no one was looking, or use a large sleeve to shield a movement towards the ground highly frowned upon. The teacup trick worked here too. Use the tea as a cover for minimal wine consumption, or even dilute the wine in your cup with tea if possible, though this was a risky maneuver. The pressure to participate in toasts and appear to drink was so strong in some eras and settings that techniques to avoid excessive alcohol consumption became quite elaborate, sometimes involving designated drinkers within a group or complex excuses related to health or religious vows. But for the solo guest trying to survive a single banquet, the simulated sip and the discreet discard were often the only options. Imagine yourself at the table, under the watchful eyes of the host and other guests. You pick up a piece of what looks suspiciously like chicken feet, a delicacy to some, a nightmare to others. You bring it to your mouth, smile, nods of encouragement come your way. You put the chicken foot in your mouth. The texture is gelatinous and bony. You begin the chew. Your jaw moves. Your tongue navigates around tiny bones and slippery skin. You make a soft, appreciative sound, maybe a small oomph. You hold it there, pretending to break it down. Time slows down. You glance around. The host is talking to someone else. Now, quick, subtle movement. You bring your teacup up. As you drink, the chicken foot finds its way somewhere, hopefully back onto your plate nestled amongst those strategically placed bones. Success. A brief moment of relief washes over you before the next dish arrives. This constant vigilance, this blend of performance and strategic maneuvering, highlights just how much social interaction in ancient China, even seemingly simple things like eating, could be imbued with layers of meaning and expectation. It wasn't just about manners, it was about demonstrating respect, understanding social hierarchy, and performing your role within the collective. And sometimes it was just about not having to eat that third piece of mystery meat or drink another cup of potent burning alcohol. The silent struggles, the hidden movements, the subtle acts of defiance against forced hospitality. These were the forgotten tricks, the quiet battles fought on the banquet table, all in the name of surviving the feast with dignity and your digestive system intact. So you've navigated the treacherous waters of the fake chew, the simulated swallow, perhaps even managed a discreet discard of that questionable texture. Your plate, a carefully constructed tableau of apparent devastation, looks like it's hosted a culinary hurricane despite your stomach remaining a relatively calm, empty lake. You've performed the act of eating, but the performance isn't just about what you do with the food. It's also about how you signal the outcome of that supposed prodigious consumption. You need to look full, genuinely, deeply, wonderfully, almost painfully full. This is where your body becomes the final canvas for deception. Forget the plate, now the focus is on you. The host glancing around isn't just checking if plates are empty, they're checking if guests are satisfied. And in a culture where generosity was measured by the amount of food consumed, a satisfied guest was the highest praise. A guest who still looks hungry or worse, looks like they haven't eaten much, is a silent indictment of the host's hospitality. You cannot let that happen. The primary signal of fullness, and perhaps the most iconic nonverbal cue, is the satisfied sigh. It needs to be just right. Not a sigh of relief, though you might be feeling that internally, not a sigh of boredom, and certainly not a sigh of physical distress. This sigh is a performance of contentment, a gentle exhalation that says, "Ah, that was so much wonderful food, I am utterly replete." It's a sigh of surrender to delicious abundance. How do you execute the perfect satisfied sigh? It's subtle. It starts with a slow, deep inhale, almost imperceptible. Then a gradual release of air through slightly parted lips, perhaps accompanied by a soft, almost inaudible sound. Your shoulders might relax slightly as you exhale. Your eyes might drift shut for just a moment or gaze upwards towards the ceiling with a look of happy exhaustion. The timing is crucial. Don't sigh after every single bite. That would be ridiculous. Save the sighs for moments when the host is looking your way, or after a particularly convincing bit of fake chewing, or when a new daunting dish is presented and you want to preemptively signal you couldn't possibly manage another bite. A sigh after a simulated sip of wine works wonders too. It's like saying, "Even the drink is filling me up." Accompanying the sigh is posture. A hungry guest sits alert, leaning forward, eager for the next morsel. A satisfied guest leans back. Your spine relaxes against the backrest of your chair if you have one. Some ancient seating arrangements were less forgiving, or you might shift your weight back onto your heels if kneeling or sitting on mats. Your hands might rest loosely in your lap or on the table edge, no longer actively poised for action. You might even gently loosen the tie of your robe around your waist, a universally understood gesture of having eaten too much. Though be careful not to overdo this and look genuinely uncomfortable. The goal is contented fullness, not impending digestive collapse. Hand gestures can also help. A common one is to gently pat your stomach, a small, discreet motion that reinforces the idea of a distended belly brimming with delicious food. You might rest a hand over your stomach as you lean back and sigh. This gesture, combined with the sigh and relaxed posture, creates a powerful trifecta of nonverbal signals, broadcasting your status as a well-fed, happy guest. Imagine the host seeing you leaning back, eyes slightly closed, gently patting your belly after a sigh. Instant success. Ah, the host thinks, "My guest is truly enjoying my hospitality." Little do they know your stomach is echoing with the sound of silence and strategically placed broccoli stems. Facial expressions are your close-up performance. A subtle smile plays on your lips. Your eyes convey warmth and appreciation. You might look slightly weary, but it's the pleasant exhaustion that comes after a great meal, not the strained look of someone who just wants to escape. The key is that the expression aligns with the idea of satisfaction. You're not frowning, you're not looking anxious. You're not constantly scanning for the exit. You are present, relaxed, and radiating postprandial bliss. Think of that moment after Thanksgiving dinner, when everyone is slumped on the couch, loosening belts and muttering about tryptophan. That's the vibe you're aiming for, but perhaps slightly more refined, suitable for ancient dignitaries rather than modern couch potatoes. This requires conscious effort, of course. You are performing calmness and satiety while possibly feeling mild nausea from holding food in your mouth, anxiety about getting caught, and genuine hunger from not actually eating. It's a tightrope walk requiring you to compartmentalize your internal state from your external presentation. Your face is saying, "More. Oh, my dear host, I couldn't possibly, I am stuffed to the brim." And while your stomach is quietly sobbing, "Is there a doggy bag option for the way home?" Consider the overall energy you project. A hungry person has an active energy, ready to engage, ready to eat. A truly full person's energy slows down. They might speak a little more slowly, move a little less abruptly. You emulate this. Your movements become more deliberate, less hurried. You might sip your tea slowly, take longer pauses in conversation, which also helps divert attention from your plate, as we'll discuss later. Everything about you needs to say, "I am done. I have finished the race, and I have finished it magnificently." The subtle calibration of these signals is an art form. Overdoing it can be as risky as not doing it enough. A sigh that's too loud or too dramatic might seem fake or even suggest discomfort rather than contentment. Leaning back too far might look lazy or disrespectful. Patting your stomach too vigorously might look like you're genuinely in pain or trying to induce vomiting, definitely not the goal. It's about finding the balance, making the nonverbal cues feel organic, like the natural conclusion to a delightful meal. You want to blend in with the genuinely satisfied guest becoming just another happy patron of the host's generosity. Imagine sitting there. A new platter of steaming dumplings arrives, a dish you particularly detest, perhaps filled with tripe and something suspiciously slimy. You look at it, a slight smile still lingering from your last performance of satisfaction. You lean back ever so slightly. A gentle sigh escapes your lips. Your hand rests near your stomach. Your eyes meet the host's, and you offer a small appreciative nod, a look that conveys, "Ah, dumplings, how marvelous. If only I had an inch of space left." It's a silent conversation, a negotiation using only body language and subtle sounds. The host, seeing your performance, is likely to understand. They've seen this before. They might even offer the dish to someone else, or gently say something like, "Yes, these are quite filling, aren't they?" confirming their acceptance of your declared state of fullness. This elaborate dance of nonverbal cues wasn't just about avoiding more food. It was deeply ingrained in the social fabric of ancient China. Hospitality was paramount, and accepting that hospitality meant demonstrating appreciation. Consuming vast quantities was one way, but gracefully bowing out while appearing. To have consumed vast quantities was another, perhaps more sophisticated way. It showed you understood the rules, you respected the host's effort, and you were capable of navigating complex social situations with finesse. A mainstream historical fact that highlights the importance of perception and ritual in ancient Chinese banquets is the emphasis on the presentation of food. Dishes were often arranged aesthetically, sometimes in elaborate sculptures or patterns. This suggests that the visual and performative aspects of the meal were nearly as important as the nutritional ones. Guests were expected to appreciate the artistry, not just devour the food. Your performance of satisfaction, therefore, was also a form of appreciating the host's efforts in providing such a visually and conceptually rich experience. A quirky tidbit is the historical practice of using very large serving dishes. While individual bowls existed, many dishes were presented on massive platters, sometimes requiring multiple people to carry them. This sheer scale reinforced the idea of overwhelming abundance. It also meant that guests were constantly faced with enormous piles of food, making the task of making one's own portion look depleted and one's own body look full even more challenging and necessary. You weren't just eating a meal, you were confronting a mountain range of culinary generosity. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on displaying physical signs of fullness was purely about politeness and saving face for the host, or if it also served a practical purpose in managing resources. With banquets featuring dozens or even hundreds of dishes, perhaps the performance of satiety was a socially sanctioned way to signal to the servers and the host that you were genuinely finished, helping to manage the flow of food and prevent unnecessary waste or pressure to keep eating indefinitely. Was it social grace or a clever way to signal "no more please" without being overtly impolite? The truth is likely a blend of both. The performance of fullness wasn't limited to size and posture. It could also involve feigning a slight struggle to move or stand up after the meal, leaning on an attendant if you were of high enough status to have one, or even making comments about needing to take a walk to aid digestion, a polite way of suggesting you were bursting at the seams. Everything contributed to the narrative, "I have eaten gloriously and am now wonderfully full." Think about the subtle energy drain of maintaining this facade. You're not just sitting there. You're constantly monitoring the room, assessing who is looking, calculating the optimal moment for a sigh, adjusting your posture, keeping that satisfied smile plastered on your face. It's tiring work. It's less of a relaxing dinner and more of a high-stakes theatrical production where the only audience reviews that matter are the host's approving nods. And it wasn't just about being convincing in the moment. The memory of your performance lingered. A guest known for leaving banquets looking refreshed and still peckish might gain a reputation as someone who didn't appreciate the host's efforts. A guest who gracefully bowed out, exhibiting all the signs of delightful repletion, would enhance the host's reputation for generosity and ensure future invitations. So your post-meal body language had consequences beyond just the evening itself. It contributed to your social standing and the host's. Imagine the layers. You've carefully arranged, the food performed the fake chew, and now you're executing the perfect sigh, leaning back, patting your stomach, eyes twinkling with mock satisfaction. All of this is happening while your actual stomach growls softly, and you mentally catalog the dishes you wish you could have eaten without consequence. It's a sophisticated multitasking of deception and social navigation. This wasn't just a casual slump in your chair. It was a deliberate choice, a conscious act designed to communicate a specific message. It was a performance as integral to the banquet ritual as the formal greetings, the order of toasts, or the presentation of the dishes themselves. It showed respect for the social contract, even if you were subtly subverting the part about actual food consumption. It was about demonstrating that you understood the spirit of the generosity, even if your physical capacity couldn't match the letter of it. So as the banquet nears its end and the final courses, often elaborate desserts or noodle dishes designed to truly finish you off, are presented, your performance of fullness reaches its crescendo. The sighs become a little more frequent, the leaning back a little more pronounced, the gentle stomach pats a little more emphasized. You are a living, breathing monument to the host's overwhelming generosity, a testament to their ability to fill their guests to bursting point. You are the picture of contentment, of satiety, of a mission accomplished, even if the mission accomplished was actually avoiding eating most of it. And as you prepare for the formal goodbyes, rising slowly from your seat, as if burdened by the sheer volume of deliciousness you've consumed, the final impression you leave is one of a guest utterly overwhelmed by the host's hospitality. You depart not just unscathed, but having enhanced the host's reputation and your own, all thanks to a few well-timed sighs, a bit of strategic leaning, and a convincing smile. The forgotten tricks indeed, simple yet profound in their social impact. So you've mastered the visual cues. Your belly is ostensibly bursting, your sighs are perfectly timed laments to culinary overload, and your posture screams defeated by deliciousness. You look the part, but looking the part isn't always enough. Sometimes, despite your best physical performance, the relentless tide of hospitality continues. A server approaches with another steaming bowl. The host beams and says, "You simply must try this simmered sparrow tongue soup. It's a house specialty." Or surely you can manage just one more mooncake. This is where the nonverbal battlefield shifts to the verbal one. You need words. You need polite, eloquent, utterly convincing words to reinforce your physical declaration of satiety and gently, firmly refuse without causing offense. Refusal in ancient Chinese society, especially regarding food offered by a host, was a delicate art. Direct, blunt refusals were generally considered rude. Saying, "No, I don't want any," was akin to saying your food is terrible or your generosity is unwelcome, which, as we've established, was a major social faux pas. The goal was to decline the offer while simultaneously praising the offering and the offerer. You needed to perform a linguistic ballet of gratitude and gentle demurral. The most common and essential tactic was to express overwhelming fullness and lavish praise. Phrases like, "Ah, esteemed host, your bounty is too great. My stomach is already overflowing from the magnificent dishes I have had the privilege to sample," were your bread and butter. You are essentially saying, "I cannot eat more, but it is because you have been too generous and the food is too good, not because I lack appetite or disrespect your offering." See, it's a backhanded compliment that isn't backhanded at all. It's sincere praise used as a shield. You might accompany this with a slight bow, a hand placed over your pretended full stomach, or a wistful glance at the dish you are declining as if your soul desperately wants to try it, but your physical capacity is simply not there. The verbal refusal is an extension of the physical performance you've already perfected. It adds a layer of auditory reinforcement to your visual narrative. Another common strategy was to shift the focus to future enjoyment. Alas, you might say, "My current state of repletion prevents me from fully appreciating this exquisite dish. Perhaps another time when I am not already so wonderfully burdened by your previous courses, I may have the honor of trying it." This implies that the dish is so fantastic it requires a special state of hunger to truly appreciate it, a state you simply cannot achieve right now, thanks to the host's other amazing food. It kicks the can down the road politely, deferring the consumption without outright rejecting the food or the offer. Sometimes you could enlist the help of others, subtly or overtly. If another guest was genuinely still eating, you might gesture towards them politely, of course, and say, "Perhaps my friend here, who possesses a truly admirable capacity, could sample this while I simply admire its presentation." This deflects the offer onto someone else and frames your refusal, not as a personal failing, but as a matter of differing physical capabilities while still complimenting the dish. Be careful with this, though. You don't want to accidentally throw a genuinely full friend under the bus. Coordination is key, or a well-chosen victim who you know is also employing their own tricks. Then there was the tactic of claiming a specific temporary incapacity. "Ah, forgive me, noble host," you might murmur, perhaps with a slight, carefully calibrated grimace, the kind that suggests mild discomfort from overeating. Not from food aversion. My humble stomach, usually a boundless vessel, seems to be experiencing a momentary fullness. Perhaps a glass of tea will help settle it, but I fear adding more just now would be unwise. This introduces a medical-adjacent reason, suggesting a temporary physical limitation beyond your control. It's not that you don't want the food, it's that your body is staging a tiny, polite rebellion due to previous overindulgence. You could also try diverting the conversation entirely. As the dish approaches, you quickly interject with an engaging question or a fascinating observation. Speaking of exquisite things, you might say, fixing your gaze on a piece of calligraphy on the wall, "I was just admiring that scroll. The brushwork is remarkable. Is it from the hand of Master Wang?" Or, "Tell me, esteemed host, have you heard the latest news from the capital?" The goal is to subtly interrupt the food presentation ritual and shift the focus of the host and servers away from your plate and onto a new topic. If you can draw them into a lengthy discussion, the dish might be offered to others or simply left on the table without direct pressure on you. This requires quick thinking and a decent knowledge of current events, art, or whatever might capture your host's interest. It's like pulling a verbal fire alarm, except the only emergency is the impending arrival of more duck feet. Imagine the scene. A server is heading your way with a massive platter piled high with glistening pork. You've just executed a perfect sigh. Your hand is resting on your belly. Now, as the server gets close, you lean forward slightly, not towards the pork, but towards the host, catch their eye, and say with genuine-sounding enthusiasm, "Noble host, I was just discussing with the gentleman beside me the quality of the silk your robes are made of. Truly exceptional. Might I ask where it was sourced?" You are deflecting with flattery and curiosity. It's a charm offensive designed to make the host forget their current mission of force-feeding you. Historians still argue whether these formal, elaborate refusal phrases were universally understood as polite ways of saying "no thank you" without causing shame, or if some hosts genuinely took offense if guests didn't gorge themselves. The context, the relationship between host and guest in the specific social setting likely played a huge role. A close friend hosting might understand a more relaxed refusal, while a formal banquet with a high-ranking official might require strict adherence to the most flowery language of praise and demurral. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all script. A quirky tidbit relates to the sheer volume of dishes served at major banquets. Some imperial or high-status banquets could feature dozens, even hundreds of different dishes presented over several hours. With this level of culinary onslaught, guests had to develop sophisticated strategies for managing consumption, both physically and verbally. You couldn't possibly eat a meaningful portion of everything. The performance of satiety and the art of polite refusal weren't just about avoiding an extra helping. They were necessary survival skills in a gastronomic marathon. Trying to sample everything would be like attempting to drink an ocean with a teacup. Utterly impossible and frankly rather uncomfortable. The verbal strategies also had to be adaptable. You couldn't use the same phrase every time. Varying your language kept it from sounding like a rehearsed script. You might praise the texture of one dish, you refuse the aroma of another, and the presentation of a third. You needed a vocabulary of culinary appreciation and personal incapacity. This fish, I'm sure, is prepared with unparalleled skill, but my current state, or the fragrance of this broth is intoxicating, but my stomach feels unusually settled after the previous courses. Light joke time. You know, mastering these ancient refusal techniques sounds exhausting. It makes modern-day dieting feel like a walk in the park. At least today you can just say, "Oh, I'm watching my carbs," or "I have an allergy," and people usually just nod. Trying to explain that your soul wants the dumplings, but your abdominal cavity has temporarily unionized against further intake is much more complex. Another tactic was to complement a specific non-food aspect of the banquet. The music, the decor, the conversation, the quality of the wine which you could sip sparingly. By focusing praise on these elements, you subtly implied that the banquet was a success, not just because of the food, but because of the overall experience. This again lessened the pressure on you to validate the host's efforts solely through prodigious eating. This music is so enchanting, it has quite filled my senses. You might exclaim, cleverly implying that your senses are so full they have no room for food. It's a stretch, sure, but in the haze of a long banquet combined with your physical performance, it might just work. The difficulty was maintaining consistency. You couldn't just say you were full and then be seen enthusiastically trying a new dish 10 minutes later, unless it was a tiny mandatory bite as a show of respect. Your verbal refusals had to align with your physical presentation. If you just claimed you were too full for soup, but then leaned forward eagerly to listen to gossip, your body language would contradict your words. You had to maintain the slightly slumped, satiated demeanor, even while engaging in conversation. This leads to another challenge: talking while feigning discomfort and fullness, and potentially holding chewed food in your cheek. It's a multi-layered performance. You're trying to sound eloquent and appreciative while your mouth feels like a hamster's pantry. Imagine trying to deliver a perfectly crafted refusal of roasted quail while simultaneously ensuring a partially chewed piece of something or other doesn't accidentally slip out. It requires incredible control. Ah, yes, this quail. Slight pause to reposition the hidden food. It looks absolutely divine, noble host. The way the skin is crisped, already another tiny internal adjustment. Unfortunately, I find myself at a point where swallow air strategically, where my capacity has simply been overwhelmed by the preceding wonders. It's a logistical nightmare, isn't it? Like performing Shakespeare while juggling, except the juggling balls are bits of turnip. Light joke number 2. Honestly, after a banquet like this, you probably needed a separate banquet just to recover from the effort of pretending to eat. And then you'd have to pretend to be full at that one too. It's an endless loop of performative repletion. The subtle hierarchy of polite refusal was also important. Declining a dish offered by the hosts themselves required more elaborate praise and humility than declining a dish offered by a server. Declining a rare or particularly expensive dish required even greater deference and more effusive apologies for your temporary self-inflicted inability to do it justice. You needed to gauge the social weight of the offering before formulating your refusal. Was this just another generic bowl, or was it the centerpiece specially prepared in your honor? The stakes influenced the necessary level of verbal finesse. Historians also debate the extent to which hosts expected these refusals. Was it a ritual where both parties understood the guest would decline initially out of politeness, and the host would offer again, perhaps less forcefully? Or were some refusals genuinely meant to be accepted immediately? It's possible there was a nuanced dance. The first refusal was polite, the second might be slightly more firm if you were truly done, and a third might only happen if the host was exceptionally persistent, or if you were signaling something more significant than just fullness. Consider the energy drain of this constant linguistic negotiation. You're not just chatting, you're strategically deploying language to manage the flow of food and expectations. Every compliment about a dish you didn't eat, every explanation of your fullness, every conversational diversion is a calculated move. It's a mental chess game played with words and polite smiles, all while fighting the physical discomfort of having a belly that's empty but acting full. And this wasn't just for the main courses. The pressure continued through dessert and even post-meal snacks. A bowl of fruit might arrive, followed by sweet pastries. Each required a fresh wave of praise and a renewed declaration of overwhelming satiety. These oranges are undoubtedly the finest I have ever seen, noble host. But alas, my capacity for sweetness has been completely consumed by the delightful meal. Light joke number 3. You know, if they had competitive eating back then, the real competition wouldn't be who could eat the most, but who could pretend to be the fullest for the longest while actually eating the least. Now that's a sport I could get behind. The winner gets, well, probably just to leave early. Ultimately, the verbal strategies were about maintaining face, both your own and the host's. Your face was saved by not looking greedy or incapable of handling hospitality, but rather a refined individual whose limit was reached only because the hospitality was so exceptional. The host's face was saved because their guest was clearly satisfied and appreciative, even if they couldn't consume every last morsel. It transformed a potential rejection into a form of sophisticated flattery. So you sit there, a master of both physical and verbal deception. Your body language signals repletion, your words sing praises, while politely declining further offerings. You are a living testament to the success of the banquet, a walking, talking, carefully advertisement for your host's generosity. And all this is happening while your actual stomach is probably making noises that sound suspiciously like a faraway whale song, longing for sustenance. But outward appearances and carefully chosen words are everything. You've spun a web of polite refusals, a linguistic shield deflecting further culinary assaults. Your words, carefully chosen and dripping with appreciation, have reinforced the narrative of your overflowing stomach. But let's be real. Sometimes, despite your eloquent protestations and theatrical sighs, that persistent server, that beaming host manages to place more food right in front of you. Perhaps a tiny, innocent-looking bowl of something utterly rich or a single, deceptively large steamed bun. What do you do with this fresh challenge when your verbal defenses have been breached and your physical performance is already strained to its limit? You can't just leave it sitting there untouched forever. That would eventually be noticed, potentially interpreted as disdain, and completely unravel your carefully constructed illusion of blissful repletion. This is where the physical act of moving the food away from your own personal consumption zone becomes critical. Welcome to the subtle, often risky art of sharing and passing in ancient Chinese banquets when you're trying to avoid eating. This isn't the cheerful, generous sharing you do with friends today because you want them to try something delicious. This is strategic redistribution, a quiet offloading of unwanted calories executed with the finesse of a secret agent performing a handoff in a crowded marketplace. The goal is simple: make the food disappear from your immediate vicinity without eating it yourself, and ideally without anyone noticing your true intentions. One of the most straightforward methods, if the banquet setting allowed for it, was subtle redistribution among tablemates. In many ancient Chinese banquets, dishes were placed on the table for multiple people to share, rather than individual plates being served all at once. Though individual servings were also common, especially for certain dishes or at higher status events. If you were at a table with communal dishes, your strategy was twofold. First, when serving yourself from a communal dish, you took the absolute smallest, most insignificant portion possible. Perhaps just a decorative garnish, a single grain of rice, or a microscopic sliver of meat. You made a show of selecting your tiny portion with great care, as if savoring the anticipation only to take a bite so minuscule it barely registered. Second, and more importantly, for offloading, you became exceptionally generous in serving others. As a communal dish came your way, or if it was within reach, you would ladle, pick, or spoon generous portions onto the plates of your neighbors, particularly those you knew weren't pretending to be full, or if you were desperate, those who were also pretending, in a silent, conspiratorial agreement. You'd exclaim, "Oh, esteemed friend, you simply must try this. The aroma is divine," while piling their plate high. This act of generosity served multiple purposes. It deflected attention from your own lack of eating, cast you in a positive light as a considerate guest, and crucially meant there was less food left in the communal dish for you to potentially be pressured into taking later. It's a form of culinary jujitsu, using the momentum of the food flow to your advantage. This could be tricky. You had to be careful not to seem too eager to offload the food, which might arouse suspicion. Your generosity had to appear natural, an expression of genuine appreciation for the dish and concern for your fellow guests' enjoyment, not a desperate attempt to make the evidence disappear. You also risked offending someone if you piled their plate too high, especially if they were also trying to eat less. It was a delicate balance of appearing helpful while being strategically self-serving. What about food that was served directly onto your plate? This was harder to offload. You couldn't just scoop it back into a communal dish. One method was to discreetly push the food around your plate, making it look like you had eaten more than you had. You might break up pieces of meat spread sauce around or rearrange items to create gaps, giving the illusion of consumption. This required careful plate management throughout the meal. You couldn't let uneaten food accumulate. It had to look lived in, like a battlefield where significant eating had occurred. Another tactic, if you were seated near a servant or attendant, was to discreetly pass food to them. Banquets often involve servants circulating to clear plates, refill drinks, or assist guests. With a subtle gesture, a quiet word, or even just leaving a dish slightly pushed towards their path, as they cleared others, you might be able to signal that you were finished with it or didn't intend to eat it all. This was higher risk depending on the formality of the setting and the specific protocols. In some households, servants might regularly take away plates that still had food, assuming the guest was done. In others, leaving food might be seen as wasteful. Knowing the host's customs was crucial. Historians still argue whether offering unfinished food directly to servants was a widely accepted practice among all social classes, or if it was considered somewhat undignified or inappropriate in certain high-status settings. It likely varied greatly depending on regional customs, the specific era, and the relationship between the host and their staff. However, the sheer volume of food at many banquets suggests that not everything was expected to be consumed, and some mechanisms for clearing unwanted food must have existed. A quirky tidbit relates to the fate of leftovers at large banquets. While some food might be distributed among the host's household or staff, there are accounts suggesting that in certain periods untouched or partially eaten food from grand banquets might even be distributed among the poor, or given to specific groups as a form of charity or patronage. This possibility might have made guests feel slightly less guilty about leaving food, knowing it wouldn't simply be wasted, but could be repurposed. It adds another layer to the social calculus of pretending to eat. You weren't necessarily starving someone by not clearing your plate. You might be indirectly contributing to someone else's meal later. Dropping food accidentally was another potential, albeit risky method. A piece of meat slipping from your chopsticks, a bun rolling off the table. These could be plausible accidents that resulted in the food being removed from your plate without you having to eat it. Of course, doing this too often would look suspicious. It required careful timing and a believable performance of clumsy misfortune. "Oh dear, how clumsy of me." And oh, you might exclaim, while inwardly cheering as a particularly fatty piece of pork rolled under the table, destined for a less discerning diner, perhaps a hungry dog or a servant with less social pressure. Light joke number 1. Mastering the accidental food drop is basically the ancient Chinese equivalent of dropping my phone so I don't have to look at someone. It's social evasion through stage clumsiness. Another technique was to use conversation and distraction to facilitate passing or avoid being served. If a dish you particularly dreaded came around, you could quickly engage the person serving it or a nearby guest in conversation, diverting their attention. While they were distracted, you might quickly serve a generous portion to someone else or subtly nudge the dish away when they weren't looking. Or if you were offering food from a communal dish, you could get into an engaging discussion with your target, causing them to take a larger than intended portion simply out of distraction. "Tell me, noble sir, what are your thoughts on the new poetry collection from Master Lee?" You'd ask as you deftly spooned extra braised duck onto his plate. This required excellent social skills and the ability to multitask, maintaining a lively conversation, appearing engaged and appreciative of the food, and executing a subtle food transfer or avoidance maneuver simultaneously. It's the dinner party equivalent of patting your head and rubbing your stomach, except the stakes involve social standing and potential indigestion. Sometimes simply offering a dish to someone else before taking any yourself was a way to pass the buck. Before I indulge, you might say, holding up a serving spoon towards your neighbor, "May I have the pleasure of serving you first?" If they accepted a generous portion, you could then take a smaller one, or perhaps hope the dish would be moved on before you had to take any at all. This again positioned you as a generous guest while potentially reducing your own consumption. Consider the choreography of a busy banquet table. Dishes are being served, passed, shared. Conversation is flowing. Music might be playing. Servants are circulating. Amidst all this activity, you are trying to perform subtle acts of food, offloading without being detected. Your eyes are scanning the table looking for opportunities. Is someone else genuinely hungry? Is a servant approaching? Is there a distraction I can create? It's a constant low-level hum of strategic assessment happening beneath the veneer of polite dining. The type of food mattered too. Slippery noodles or easily separated rice were much harder to subtly offload than larger pieces of meat or solid buns. A whole steamed fish was challenging. You couldn't easily make a piece disappear. Small dumplings or bite-sized pastries offered more opportunities for quick, discreet transfers or accidental drops. You had to tailor your technique to the specific culinary obstacle in front of you. Trying to lose a large piece of roasted pork belly was a very different challenge than getting rid of a handful of peanuts. Light joke number 2. I bet ancient chefs were constantly frustrated wondering why so much food came back uneaten. Is it the seasoning? Is the texture wrong? No, wait, it's probably just everyone playing the "I'm so full from your previous amazing dishes" game again. The element of trust among guests could also play a role. If you were at a banquet with friends or allies who understood the unspoken social contract of avoiding overeating, you might be able to coordinate slightly more overt sharing. A knowing glance, a subtle nod could signal, "Take this off my hands," or "I'll take that difficult piece if you handle the soup." This created a micro-society of culinary survival within the larger banquet. However, with strangers or rivals, such coordination was impossible or even dangerous. You couldn't risk being exposed as someone who wasn't fully appreciating the host's generosity. Historians still argue whether specific nonverbal cues or signals were commonly used among guests at banquets to communicate about food strategies beyond general politeness. Were there subtle ways to signal, "I'm struggling here," or "I can take that if you need me to"? Or was it purely a matter of individual performance and risk-taking? Lacking detailed historical manuals on banquet stealth, we rely on interpretations of social customs and etiquette guides which often focused more on how to eat politely than how to avoid eating. Sometimes simply allowing food to linger on your plate was the only option, hoping that it would be cleared away eventually. This required careful timing. If you left food untouched for too long, it might be noticed. If you pushed it away too soon, you might be asked if something was wrong. You had to find the sweet spot where your plate looked like it had been partially consumed and then politely ignored as you moved on to other aspects of the banquet. Conversation drinks, admiring the entertainment. The danger with letting food linger was that the host might notice your relatively full plate and with misguided kindness urge you to eat more. "You haven't touched the steamed scallops," they might exclaim, prompting renewed pressure. This is why subtle offloading was preferable to passive avoidance. Making the food physically disappear was the most effective long-term strategy. Imagine the skill involved in subtly nudging a small bowl towards the edge of the table every time a servant passed, hoping it would be cleared. Or the concentration required to talk animatedly while carefully pushing unwanted vegetables to the side of your plate with your chopsticks. Each small maneuver was part of a larger performance designed to uphold the illusion of grateful, if overwhelmed, consumption. Light joke number 3. I picture someone accidentally nudging a bowl too hard, it clatters to the floor, and they have to look genuinely mortified while secretly thinking, "Yes, one less dish to worry about." The physical act of passing or offloading food was the necessary complement to the verbal and physical strategies. It was the means by which you managed the actual material evidence of your limited consumption. Without these methods, even the most convincing performance of fullness and the most eloquent refusals might eventually fail under the relentless pressure of a generous, food-focused host. You had to be both a master orator and a subtle operator, capable of praising the food while simultaneously trying to make it vanish from your plate, all while maintaining a demeanor of relaxed, albeit full enjoyment. It's enough to make you tired just thinking about it, isn't it? So you've navigated the treacherous landscape of solid food. You've mastered the subtle art of rearranging your plate, the strategic offloading to unsuspecting neighbors or sympathetic servants, and the occasional, seemingly accidental gravitational assistance for a piece of meat. But the banquet isn't just about the mountains of roast duck and platters of dumplings, is it? There's another element often flowing freely, and sometimes just as challenging to manage the drinks. From steaming cups of fragrant tea to small bowls of potent grain wine, Ju liquids play a vital role in the ancient Chinese feast, and they offer their own unique opportunities and pitfalls for the guest pretending to be utterly gloriously full. Managing your drink consumption is a crucial part of the performance, a parallel strategy running alongside your food dodging efforts. Just as with the food, your relationship with your cup is a public statement. Are you eagerly draining it, ready for a refill? Or are you sipping slowly, letting the liquid linger, signaling a leisurely pace that implies you're already feeling the weight of the meal? Your cup is your prop, your shield, and occasionally your alibi. One of the most common beverages, of course, was tea. Ubiquitous across much of Chinese history, tea could range from simple everyday brews to highly prized ceremonial varieties. At a banquet, tea served multiple purposes. It aided digestion, or was believed to offer a moment of respite from the richness of the food, and provided a non-alcoholic option. For you, however, tea is a strategic asset. A warm cup held in your hands occupies them, preventing them from idly reaching for yet another piece of candied fruit or a tempting pastry. You can cradle the cup, inhaling the aroma, stretching out the simple act of drinking into a prolonged meditation on hydration. Sipping tea slowly, almost deliberately, tells a story without words. It says, I am content, my stomach is settled. I am enjoying the essence of this fine meal, the conversation, and this soothing beverage, rather than aggressively pursuing more calories. Each tiny sip savored with apparent thoughtfulness is time bought. It's a moment when you are actively not eating, but doing something else that is perfectly acceptable within the social context of the banquet. You can take a sip, set the cup down gently, perhaps admire its porcelain, and then return to the conversation, letting the untouched food on your plate sit undisturbed for a few more precious minutes. Then there's the wine, juwan. This wasn't necessarily grape wine like you might think of today, but often fermented grain beverages or even early forms of distilled spirits, depending on the era. Wine played a much more socially charged role than tea. Toasts were common, sometimes obligatory, and refusing a toast could be seen as impolite or even an insult to the host or the person offering the toast. This presented a different kind of challenge. You couldn't just not drink the wine. You had to navigate the social rituals around it while still maintaining your I'm full facade. Light joke number 1. Trying to avoid wine toasts while pretending to be full is the ancient Chinese version of navigating a work holiday party without ending up singing karaoke off-key. High-stakes, subtle moves required. Toasts offered opportunities to pause eating as the focus shifted to the act of drinking and the accompanying pleasantries. But they also required you to consume something. The key was managing the amount consumed during these toasts. While some banquets involved large cups and expectations of draining them, others used smaller cups, and the emphasis was more on the gesture and the shared moment. You would always participate in the toast, lifting your cup, offering the appropriate polite words to your health-esteemed host, and perhaps taking a sip. The trick was making that sip as small as possible without appearing disrespectful. A delicate touch of the liquid to your lips, a tiny swallow that wouldn't even register on a measuring spoon, while your fellow guests might be taking larger gulps. You could also use the act of pouring wine for others as a way to occupy your hands and demonstrate attentiveness, again deflecting from your own lack of consumption. Offering to refill a neighbor's cup was a polite gesture, a way to engage socially without involving food. As you carefully poured the wine, you weren't eating. You were being a good guest, facilitating the flow of the banquet in a non-culinary way. Some historical records describe elaborate drinking games and rituals at banquets, sometimes involving poetry, recitation, riddles, or forfeits. These games, while potentially pressuring you to drink more, if you lost, also served as significant diversions from the primary activity of eating. Participating enthusiastically in a drinking game, perhaps with a slightly larger sip when you lost, to maintain appearances, but mostly focusing on the game itself, could be an excellent way to pass time and allow the food to sit unchallenged on your plate. It was a social contract. We are here to engage, to entertain each other. And the food is merely sustenance, fueling this intellectual or playful activity. Historians still argue whether the primary function of elaborate drinking games in ancient Chinese banquets Was social bonding entertainment or a deliberate mechanism to slow down the pace of eating and drinking, perhaps even to aid digestion by introducing pauses? It's hard to say if hosts intended these games as a digestive aid or if guests simply used them as one. But from your perspective, trying to appear full, any activity that shifted focus away from relentless eating was a godsend. Using drinks to cleanse the palate was another tactic. After taking a small bite of a particularly rich or oily dish, you could reach for your tea or wine, take a thoughtful sip, and subtly nod as if appreciating the way the drink complemented the food or cleared your mouth for the next hypothetical bite. This wasn't just good manners, it was stalling. Each palate-cleansing sip extended the time between actual acts of eating. You were performing the process of dining, tasting, savoring, cleansing, preparing for the next course, without actually consuming the core components of the meal at the expected pace. You could even strategically claim that the drinks themselves were quite filling. Ah, this tea is so fragrant and warming, it fills me with a pleasant sense of satisfaction, you might say, gesturing towards your cup. Or, this wine, while exquisite, is surprisingly substantial. I feel its warmth settling within me. While perhaps not entirely convincing, if said too often, this type of remark added to your overall narrative of repletion, suggesting that even the liquids were contributing to your feeling of fullness. It's a subtle way of saying, look, I'm even getting full from the water over here. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to drinks in ancient China is the variety of substances sometimes added to wines or teas. While not standard banquet practice for signaling fullness, historical texts mention concoctions that included herbs, spices, and even animal parts believed to have medicinal or invigorating properties. Imagine being served a wine flavored with something truly bizarre, like tiger bone, though this practice became more prevalent in later periods and is associated with traditional medicine rather than standard banquets. You'd have to feign appreciation and take a sip while mentally questioning every life choice that led you to this particular feast. But even a weird drink offered an opportunity. You could focus on its unusual flavor profile, discuss its supposed properties, and use that as another distraction from the main culinary event. Fascinating notes of, is that ginseng? And perhaps a hint of, well, I can't quite place it. Remarkable brew. You'd exclaim using the complexity of the drink to justify slow contemplative sipping. Remember the pressure from the host or server to eat. That same pressure could apply to drinking, especially wine during toasts. Another cup, the host might urge. Surely you can join us for this toast to successful harvests. Refusing wine could be harder than refusing food in some social contexts, as wine was deeply tied to rituals of respect and camaraderie. This is where your performance of being full needed to extend to your capacity for liquids as well. You might gently demur, esteemed host, your generosity knows no bounds. But alas, I fear I have already partaken so heartily that even another drop would test the limits of my current state. It's a delicate dance, accepting the gesture of the toast, perhaps touching the cup to your lips, but somehow managing to avoid ingesting much liquid. Sometimes the sheer mechanics of a banquet worked in your favor. If you were seated far from the source of refills, or if servants were busy, you might find your cup remained empty or low, providing a natural pause in the pressure to drink. Conversely, an overly attentive servant could be a menace, constantly topping up your cup the moment you took a sip, forcing you into a faster drinking pace than you desired. You had to be aware of the rhythm of service at the table and adapt your strategy accordingly. Light joke number 2. My ancient Chinese ancestor preparing for a banquet. Okay, gotta hydrate before, I get there so I can say, oh, I'm just so full of water I can't possibly drink any wine. The type of drinking vessel could also influence your strategy. Small, delicate cups invited slow, refined sips. Larger bowls might imply an expectation of heartier drinking. Knowing the customs of the host's household or the specific type of banquet could give you clues about the expected drinking pace and volume, allowing you to tailor your fullness performance accordingly. If small cups were used, you could make each tiny cup last an age. If large bowls were common, you might have to find ways to discreetly leave some liquid in the bowl without draining it, or use the pouring for others tactic more aggressively. Holding your cup was also a physical signal. A cup set firmly on the table, perhaps slightly pushed away, indicated you were finished or taking a break. A cup held loosely or being refilled indicated active participation in the drinking aspect of the meal. You could use the position of your cup to subtly communicate your status, whether you were actively engaged in drinking, taking a pause, or gracefully bowing out of the current round. Consider the sensory experience. The warmth of a teacup through your fingers, the sharp alcoholic scent of the wine, the feel of the cool porcelain against your lips. You would engage with these sensations as part of your performance. You'd inhale the aroma with a look of deep appreciation, sip with exaggerated thoughtfulness, making it clear that you were experiencing the drink fully, even if you weren't consuming much of it. This sensory engagement reinforced the idea that you were a connoisseur, appreciating the nuances of the beverage, rather than just someone avoiding calories. Light joke number 3. My ancient Chinese alter ego. Ah yes, the aroma of this wine truly speaks to the soul and helps me avoid the aroma of that 9th course of steamed tripe. Sometimes, if you were lucky, the conversation would become so engrossing that the focus would shift entirely away from eating and drinking for a period. You could participate lively in the discussion, gesturing with your hands, which ideally wouldn't be holding food or drink, nodding thoughtfully, laughing at jokes. These moments were precious opportunities to simply stop engaging with the culinary aspect of the banquet without it seeming odd. You were participating just in the non-food related social activities. Managing drinks in ancient Chinese banquets, like managing food, was a multifaceted skill. It required awareness of social customs, the ability to perform subtle physical actions, slow sipping, strategic pouring, and the verbal dexterity to complement the beverage while signaling repletion. Your cup was not just a vessel, it was an extension of your performance, a tool for pacing distraction and subtle communication. Whether nursing a small cup of tea or navigating a round of obligatory wine toasts, your goal remained the same: maintain the illusion of appreciative fullness, one sip at a time, ensuring that your presence at the banquet was a testament to your social grace, not your limitless appetite. It sounds exhausting, doesn't it? All that strategic sipping. You've successfully navigated the minefield of solid foods and used the flowing rivers of tea and wine as strategic checkpoints in your quest for perceived fullness. But the ancient Chinese banquet isn't solely about what goes into your stomach. It's a complex social ecosystem. And within this ecosystem, one of your most potent weapons against unwanted calories is the art of conversation and social engagement. It's the ultimate distraction technique, the mental equivalent of discreetly pushing your plate away. Engaging in lively conversation is the perfect excuse to stop eating. Your hands become occupied with gesturing, your focus shifts from the tantalizing aroma of roast pork to the witty remark of your neighbor. Your mouth is busy forming words instead of masticating morsels. It's a socially sanctioned pause, a moment where the pressure to consume food lessens because you are actively participating in another equally important aspect of the feast, the social bonding and intellectual exchange. Think about it, you can't simultaneously stuff your face with a steamed bun and deliver a heartfelt compliment to the host about the exquisite quality of the jasmine tea. Well, you could, but it would be rather uncouth, wouldn't it? So by leaning into the social aspect, you automatically create barriers to consumption. You turn to your left, engage your neighbor in a discussion about the recent harvest or a particularly interesting piece of calligraphy displayed in the hall. You maintain eye contact, you nod, you smile. All the while, your plate remains untouched, a silent testament to your apparent contentment and the fascinating nature of the discussion. The topics of conversation at such banquets could vary widely depending on the status of the guests and the nature of the gathering. You might discuss poetry, philosophy, history, current events, or simply exchange pleasantries and gossip. Whatever the subject, your goal is to be an active participant. Ask questions, offer opinions politely, of course, listen intently. The more engrossed you appear in the dialogue, the less attention anyone will pay to the fact that your plate still looks suspiciously full of delicacies. Flattery, when applied judiciously, was also an excellent tool. Complimenting the host on their impeccable taste, the skill of their cooks, the beauty of their home, or the quality of the entertainment wasn't just good manners. It was a way to occupy time and deflect attention from your own eating habits. Esteemed host, this braised fish is truly a masterpiece. The subtle blend of ginger and soy, it's quite remarkable. You might exclaim, perhaps, after taking a tiny, almost invisible bite to justify the comment. Saying these things takes time, requires attention, and positions you as a discerning guest who is appreciating the quality of the meal, not merely its quantity. Light joke number 1. My ancient Chinese alter ego's inner monologue. Okay, compliment the host on his garden, that's 3 minutes saved. Ask about his son's studies, another 2. Express awe at his collection of bronze vessels. Maybe I can make it through the soup course. Engaging with other guests was just as important. You could turn to the person across the table and inquire about their journey, their family, or their opinions on a trending topic. Sharing anecdotes, laughing at jokes, offering words of wisdom, all of this consumed valuable banquet time that you weren't using for chewing. It was a social calorie burn, in a way diverting energy from digestion to interaction. Beyond mere conversation, banquets often featured more structured social activities. We mentioned drinking games in the previous section, but there were other forms of entertainment and engagement. Poetry composition was a common and highly valued activity among the educated elite. Guests might be given a theme or a rhyme scheme and tasked with composing a poem on the spot. This was a fantastic time killer. Hours could be spent with guests taking turns reciting their verses, critiquing others' work, and engaging in intellectual banter related to the poetry. Imagine the scene. Everyone is focused on the guest laboring over a couplet or listening intently as someone reads a newly composed piece. The food sits idly by. You could nod thoughtfully, offer a quiet, excellent cadence, or pose a question about the poet's word choice. Your brain is engaged, your social persona is active, and your stomach is getting a much-needed break. Participating in, or even just attentively listening to poetry composition, was a prime opportunity to avoid eating without appearing bored or impolite. Riddles were another popular form of entertainment that served a similar purpose. A guest might pose a riddle to the group, and everyone would ponder the answer. Solving riddles required concentration and discussion, again shifting the focus away from the food. The collective mental effort created a shared experience that wasn't centered around consumption. Mainstream historical fact. During the Tang Dynasty, banquets among the literati often revolved as much around poetry and refined conversation as they did around food and drink, sometimes even more so. Famous gatherings like the Orchid Pavilion Gathering in 353 CE, though perhaps not a typical massive banquet, highlight the importance of poetry and intellectual exchange at social events among the elite. While later dynasties continued this tradition, the Tang is particularly noted for its flourishing poetic culture being integrated into social occasions. Storytelling was also common. Guests might share tales of their travels, historical anecdotes, or even fictional narratives. A good storyteller could captivate the entire table, freezing everyone in rapt attention. If you had any storytelling talent yourself, this was your moment to shine and starve yourself subtly. Launching into a long, winding tale meant you absolutely could not be eating while you spoke. It was a socially acceptable performance that bought you significant time away from the business of consuming calories. Sometimes professional entertainers might be present, musicians, dancers, or even skilled conversationalists or jesters. While enjoying their performance, the focus would naturally shift from the guests to the performers. You could watch with apparent fascination, using the entertainment as another barrier between you and the food. Oh, look at the delicate footwork of that dancer. Simply mesmerizing, you'd say, using the admiration as an excuse to forget the dumpling sitting forlornly on your plate. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of extensive poetry composition, riddles, and other non-culinary entertainment at high-status banquets was primarily a reflection of elite cultural values, a deliberate mechanism to showcase intellectual prowess, or also serve the practical function of pacing the meal and preventing guests from overeating too quickly. Perhaps it was a happy confluence of all these factors. From your perspective, desperately trying to seem full, it was a lifesaver. Movement could also be key if the structure of the banquet allowed for it. Sometimes guests weren't strictly confined to their seats throughout the entire event. There might be opportunities to stroll in a garden if the banquet was held in a home with one-view artwork, or engage in conversations with guests at other tables. Taking a temporary break from your seat to admire a view or speak privately with someone was a perfect way to physically distance yourself from the table full of food. Excuse me, I must just take a moment to admire this exquisite rock formation in the garden. You'd say making your escape for a few minutes, allowing your plate to be cleared, or simply remain undisturbed. A quirky or fringe tidbit. In some periods and regions, specific etiquette guides for banquets became incredibly detailed. They might specify not just how to eat and drink, but also how to converse, whom to speak to first, and even the appropriate facial expressions for different situations. Imagine trying to maintain your pleasantly full expression while also remembering the correct protocol for complimenting a specific type of porcelain or asking about the host's ancestors. It adds another layer of performative complexity to the already challenging task of food avoidance. Using conversation as a shield required a certain level of social skill. You couldn't just sit there silently while everyone else talked. That would draw unwanted attention. You had to be engaged, contributing just enough to be seen as a pleasant and active guest, but without becoming the absolute center of attention, unless you were telling a captivating story, of course. It was about finding the right balance present and participating, but subtly directing your energy towards social interaction rather than consumption. You could use your hands during conversation, pointing out something across the room, tracing patterns on the table, or holding a teacup while speaking, all served to keep your hands busy and away from reaching for food. Leaning forward attentively when someone was speaking, or leaning back with a relaxed posture when you were talking, were physical cues that signaled your engagement in the dialogue, further reinforcing the idea that you were occupied with more than just the contents of your plate. Light joke number 2. He wasn't just pretending to be full, he was a master conversationalist. Could talk his way out of a third, helping faster than you could say Peking duck. Even seemingly simple acts like excusing yourself to use the facilities offered a temporary reprieve. While perhaps not a strategy you could use repeatedly, a brief absence from the table was a guaranteed period where no one could pressure you to eat or drink. It was a mini vacation from the performance, a chance to take a deep breath before returning to the fray. The overall atmosphere of the banquet contributed to the effectiveness of using conversation as a tactic. The background noise of many voices, the sounds of music or entertainment, and the general movement of servants all created a level of controlled chaos where your individual eating habits were less likely to be scrutinized minute by minute, provided you were visibly participating in the social flow. If you were just sitting there silently looking bored or uncomfortable, you'd stick out. But if you were animated, laughing, talking, you blended in as just another guest enjoying the social aspects of the event. Consider the power of a well-timed laugh. A hearty chuckle at a witty remark, or a gentle smile at a polite joke made you seem engaged and happy, someone who was thoroughly enjoying the entire banquet experience, not just the food part. These social signals were just as important as the physical signals, like holding your stomach or pushing food around. They created a holistic impression of a guest who was satisfied and comfortable, perhaps because they were already pleasantly full. Light joke number 3. My ancient Chinese etiquette coach. Remember, student, a genuine-sounding laugh at a host's terrible pun is worth 3 untouched bowls of rice. Sometimes the conversation could take a turn towards health or well-being. Guests might discuss remedies, longevity practices, or the importance of moderation. These discussions offered perfect opportunities to reinforce your narrative of fullness. Indeed, you might chime in thoughtfully. Moderation is key. I find that a truly satisfying meal is one where you appreciate every bite and know when you have had just enough to feel comfortably nourished. This sounded wise and discerning while conveniently explaining why you weren't piling your plate high. Using conversation and social interaction effectively at an ancient Chinese banquet was a sophisticated strategy. It required quick thinking, social grace, and the ability to appear genuinely engaged in non-culinary activities. It wasn't just about not eating, it was about doing something else that was expected and valued in that setting. By becoming a master of conversation, a keen listener, a witty participant in games, or an appreciative audience member for entertainment, you could transform the banquet from a test of your stomach capacity into a showcase of your social finesse, all while successfully maintaining the crucial illusion that you were perhaps just a little too full. So your chopsticks have finished their ballet of feigned satiety, or maybe you've settled them just so, signaling a graceful pause. But visual cues only get you so far right. What about the sound? The silent performance of posture and placement needs an auditory complement, a subtle soundtrack to your state of manufactured fullness. In ancient China, just as today in certain social contexts, the noises you made or didn't make during and after eating could speak volumes. We're not talking about chewing with your mouth open. That's generally a no-go, ancient or modern, unless you're going for a very specific kind of impression, which probably isn't politely full. No, we're talking about the deliberate or seemingly involuntary sounds that declared your internal state, or at least the state you wanted others to believe you were in. Think about the subtle murmurs of appreciation. You take a small bite, maybe one last strategically chosen morsel, using those artful chopsticks we discussed, and instead of launching into a lengthy description of its flavors, which might suggest you're still analyzing and therefore still hungry, you let out a soft, almost inaudible sound of pleasure. A little hum, a quiet mmm, with your mouth mostly closed. It says, "This is so good, I'm simply savoring the very last bit I could possibly manage." It's the sound of someone treasuring the final moments of a wonderful experience, not someone gearing up for round two. You could even pair it with a slow blink and a small, contented smile. It's low-effort acting, honestly mostly involving your diaphragm and maybe a tiny twitch of your lips. Then there are the sighs. Not sighs of despair, mind you, but sighs of deep, genuine satisfaction. The kind you might let out after finishing a perfect cup of tea on a cold day or sinking into a warm bath. It's a slow exhalation, perhaps accompanied by leaning back slightly in your seat or resting a hand gently on your likely empty or almost empty stomach. This isn't just breathing, it's performative breathing. You're literally exhaling your fullness into the room. A single, well-timed sigh like this, especially after everyone else has slowed down or stopped, serves as an audible period mark on your personal eating sentence. It's the sonic equivalent of putting down your chopsticks and placing them neatly. Ah, you seem to say, what a magnificent meal. I am utterly, wonderfully done. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or perhaps the slightly too much food in the stomach, the strategic belch. Okay, hold on. Before you recoil, understand that historical attitudes towards bodily functions in public could vary wildly compared to modern Western etiquette. While loud, uncontrolled belching was likely seen as rude then, as now there are accounts from various cultures, including potentially aspects of ancient China, depending on the specific era and social context, where a more controlled expulsion of air could be interpreted perhaps generously as a sign of appreciation for the food and the host's generosity. It was in a very literal sense letting the host know that the food had successfully entered your system and was being processed, implying you had eaten your fill. Historians still argue whether the polite belch was a widespread custom across all social classes and time periods in ancient China, or if it was a more localized or informal practice, maybe more accepted among commoners than at court. Some texts mention a general preference for quiet and restraint at the table, which would contradict the idea of deliberate belching. However, other sources or interpretations suggest that in certain contexts, a discreet, almost silent release might have been tolerated or even seen as a natural bodily response to a hearty meal, not necessarily rude. It's a fascinating debate because it clashes so strongly with our modern sensibilities. Could you imagine doing that at a fancy restaurant today? You'd be escorted out faster than you could say General Cho. But in a different time, a different place, maybe it was less about being gross and more about being effective. If this polite belch was a genuine, albeit perhaps niche signal of fullness, how would you perform it politely? Certainly not a booming, table-rattling roar. Perhaps it was a quiet, almost internal effort, maybe accompanied by covering your mouth with a hand, a gesture of acknowledging the sound while minimizing its impact. It wouldn't be a performance of rudeness, but rather a quick, discreet declaration of having reached capacity. Think of it less as a party trick and more as a necessary bodily function, briefly acknowledged. A quirky tidbit here is that in some other historical cultures, an audible belch was genuinely considered a compliment, a sign that you had enjoyed the meal so much you were physically reacting. While less strongly documented as a compliment in ancient China universally, the idea of it signaling completion of eating might have existed in certain circles. It's definitely one of those historical details that makes you go, huh, different times, different norms. It certainly adds a layer of difficulty to your performance of being full, if you had to master the art of the just right belch. Loud enough to be noticed, quiet enough not to offend, and timed perfectly after the main courses. A Goldilocks zone of gaseous release, if you will. Definitely harder than just pushing food around with chopsticks. Beyond the more dramatic sounds, think about the quieter ones. The gentle clinking of a porcelain teacup being placed back on its saucer after a slow, deliberate sip of tea, another signal of pausing or concluding the meal. The soft rustle of your robes as you settle back, the quiet clearing of your throat before politely refusing a refill of your bowl. These seemingly minor sounds create an acoustic landscape of satiety. It's not just about the absence of the sounds of vigorous eating, but the presence of the sounds of comfortable rest and reflection. You're painting an auditory picture of a stomach that is peacefully at rest, not one that is demanding more input. You could also use verbal cues, though perhaps more as reinforcers than primary signals. Softly saying things like, "Ah, the flavors linger so wonderfully," or "I find myself quite content," or the ever-classic, "I couldn't possibly manage another bite, though I am tempted," delivered with a gentle smile and that accompanying satisfied sigh. These phrases spoken in a relaxed, maybe slightly drowsy tone solidify the auditory message. It's the narration over the soundtrack of your performance. You're confirming the signals your body language and subtle sounds are already sending. Think about the rhythm of the banquet itself. As the meal progresses, the initial flurry of activity and the sounds of eating would gradually subside. People would eat more slowly, conversation might pick up, and the dominant sounds would shift from the clinking of bowls and chopsticks to voices and perhaps music. Your task in performing fullness was to align your own auditory output with this later, more relaxed phase of the meal, even if your internal state grumbling, stomach, remember, was still stuck in the initial flurry phase. You had to project the sound of the end of the meal from the moment you decided you were full, regardless of when that actually happened. This auditory performance required timing, letting out that contented sigh just as the host was about to offer you a second serving of a particularly rich dish perfection, accidentally letting slip a stomach rumble while everyone else is quietly sipping tea. Less ideal, it was a high-stakes game of sound management, and honestly, managing internal bodily noises while trying to project external composure sounds incredibly difficult. It's like trying to keep a straight face while someone is telling a really bad joke. Sometimes things just slip out, and in this case, the consequences could be more food, which was the opposite of your goal. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the importance of hospitality in ancient Chinese culture. Hosting a banquet was a significant way to show respect, build relationships, and display status. A good host ensured their guests were well-fed and comfortable. Conversely, a good guest showed appreciation for the host's efforts. Part of showing appreciation wasn't just saying thank you, but also visibly and audibly enjoying the meal, and knowing when and how to signal that you had reached a state of grateful satiety, allowing the host to feel they had been successful in their hospitality. The subtle art of signaling fullness was intertwined with the broader social rituals of hosting and being hosted. It was a polite negotiation conducted through gesture and sound. So while you were mastering the visual language of placing chopsticks and leaning back, you were also tuning into the soundscape of the banquet. The quiet murmur of appreciation, the soft sigh, perhaps even that controversial, discreet belch. These were the auditory brushes painting the picture of your full stomach. You were creating a full sensory experience for the observer, assuring them through sight and sound that you had been wonderfully, completely sated by their generous offering. It's a historical performance art, really combining mime with Foley sound effects, all to avoid eating another spring roll. Imagine the practice required, sitting alone practicing your satisfied sigh or your grateful Probably looked pretty odd. And think about the environment. Were you at an outdoor feast where sounds dissipated quickly, or an enclosed quiet hall where every clink and sigh echoed? The acoustics of the dining space would surely influence the volume and nature of your auditory signals. A louder environment might require a slightly more emphatic sigh or murmur, while a quieter one would necessitate extreme subtlety to avoid drawing undue attention. It adds another layer of complexity to this forgotten trick. You weren't just performing the act ras of being full, you were performing it in context. The historical sources that touch upon dining etiquette often focus more on the visual aspects. How to sit, how to hold utensils, how to receive dishes. The auditory dimension is less frequently codified in surviving texts, which is part of why historians still debate the nuances, especially regarding things like belching. Was it a formal rule? An informal understanding, did it vary by region or dialect? We're piecing together clues from fragmentary texts, poetry, and artistic depictions, none of which come with a handy sound recording. So we have to infer the auditory landscape from hints about behavior and social norms. Consider the possibility of using sounds to actively deter further offerings. A slight groan, perhaps. Not a groan of pain, but a groan of, "Oh, I couldn't possibly, I'm about to burst." This feels a bit less polite than the contented sigh, maybe more of a last resort tactic. But if the host was particularly insistent, perhaps a dramatic but still PG-13 physical and auditory reaction was necessary. A hand pressed to the stomach, a widening of the eyes, a soft moan that communicated pleasurable pain from overindulgence, not actual distress. It's a risky move, though, as it could easily be misinterpreted or simply seen as overly theatrical. You'd have to know your audience, i.e., your host and fellow guests. Ultimately, the auditory aspect of pretending to be full was about controlling the narrative your body was telling through sound. It was about using subtle noises, sighs, murmurs, maybe even a carefully modulated belch, to reinforce the visual story of satiety already being told by your posture and your chopsticks. It's another layer in the complex, often invisible social performance that took place around the dinner table in ancient China. And mastering it meant you could navigate the pressures of hospitality with grace, or at least the convincing appearance of grace, even when your stomach was staging a full-blown rebellion demanding immediate reinforcements. It adds a whole new meaning to dinner theater, doesn't it? You were the star, the sound designer, and the hungry audience all rolled into one. So you've orchestrated the symphony of satiety with your subtle sighs and strategic murmurs, painting an auditory landscape of a happily overwhelmed stomach. You've arranged your chopsticks like a peace treaty between your appetite and the abundance before you. Your posture speaks volumes, leaning back just so a picture of comfortable completion. But sometimes, despite your most exquisite nonverbal performance, the host, beaming with pride at their culinary prowess, will still offer you more. This is the moment the silent pantomime must yield to the spoken word. You need a verbal exit strategy, a carefully crafted refusal that is as polite as it is firm, a linguistic shield against the onslaught of further sustenance. This is where the subtle art of saying no thank you, without ever actually saying no, comes into play. In ancient China, as in many cultures built on complex social hierarchies and deep respect for hospitality, a blunt refusal could be seen as an insult. It might imply the food wasn't good enough, or that you didn't appreciate the host's generosity. To simply push away a dish or say, "No, I don't want any more," might land with the grace of a dropped porcelain vase. Your goal wasn't just to avoid eating, it was to avoid causing offense while doing so. You had to refuse in a way that simultaneously praised the food, honored the host, and lamented your own physical limitations, real or imagined. It was a verbal dance as intricate as any physical one you'd performed with your chopsticks. The language of refusal wasn't about stating a simple fact, "I am full." It was about expressing a complex sentiment. You were full because the host was so generous. You couldn't eat more, despite how delicious everything was. Your inability to consume another bite was a tribute to the abundance and quality already provided. See the twist, your limitation became a compliment to the host. It's like telling someone, "Your garden is so beautiful, I'm overwhelmed by its perfection and couldn't possibly take another flower," when really you just don't have any more vases. It's polite deflection raised to an art form. Think of the phrases you might employ. They needed to be steeped in courtesy and appreciation. You wouldn't say, "Nope, can't eat another thing." Instead, you might murmur something like, "Ah, esteemed host, your bounty has already filled my humble stomach to the brim. My appreciation overflows even more than my plate." And this acknowledges their generosity. Your bounty states your feigned condition, "Filled my humble stomach to the brim," and reinforces your gratitude, my appreciation overflows. It's a multi-layered compliment masquerading as a dietary restriction, and it requires a certain delivery. Soft-spoken, sincere, maybe, with a gentle hand gesture towards your chest or stomach, reinforcing the verbal with the visual. Another common approach was to focus on the quality of the food rather than the quantity you'd already consumed. The flavors simply divine. They linger so beautifully on the palate that adding anything further would only diminish the exquisite memory of what I've already enjoyed. This is high-level flattery. You're essentially saying the food is too good to be piled on indiscriminately. You're treating it like a fine perfume. A little is perfect, too much spoils the effect. This kind of phrase worked particularly well if the dish being offered was indeed quite flavorful or rich. It made your refusal sound like an act of connoisseurship, not just avoidance. Oh, that spiced duck, utterly magnificent. I simply must preserve the pure sensation of the bite I just had. To eat another would be sacrilege to its perfection. See, now you're not full. You're a food critic performing a sacred ritual of flavor preservation. You might also lean into the sheer abundance of the meal as the reason for your incapacity. Never before have I witnessed such a magnificent spread. Each dish is a marvel in itself. Alas, my capacity pales in comparison to your immense generosity. I have sampled deeply and my heart is as full as my stomach. Here the sheer scale of the banquet becomes the justification. It wasn't your fault you couldn't eat more. It was the host's overwhelming success in providing so much wonderful food. It's a delicate tightrope walk. You're praising their abundance while using it as an excuse not to engage further with it. It's the historical equivalent of saying, "Wow, this buffet is huge, I could never eat all this," while secretly planning your escape route. Sometimes the refusal might be less about a direct statement of fullness and more about a deferral or a shift in focus. If offered another bowl of rice, you might say, "Thank you, honored host, but I find myself wishing to savor the remarkable taste of this delightful vegetable dish a moment longer." This doesn't say you're full, it says you're preoccupied with appreciating something else that is also part of the host's offering. It's a polite way of saying, "Not now, maybe later." Or more realistically, "Not now, and hopefully you'll forget about me in a minute." It buys you time and redirects attention. Historians still argue whether there were standardized phrases for polite refusal that were taught and used across different regions and social strata in ancient China, or if this was more of an improvisational skill, refined through experience and observation within specific social circles. While etiquette manuals existed, they often focused on broader principles of conduct rather than providing a phrase book for every social interaction. So while the need for polite refusal was universal, the exact words used might have varied considerably. Was there a government-mandated fullness refusal phrase number 3? Probably not. But there were certainly common rhetorical strategies. A quirky tidbit is the potential use of specific regional dialects or honorifics that added layers of politeness and humility to the refusal. Depending on where you were, and the social standing of your host, the level of formal language and self-deprecation, my humble stomach, unworthy capacity would shift. Mastering this wasn't just about knowing what to say, but knowing the culturally specific way to say it, like knowing whether to use "Sir" or "Mr." or "Your Highness," depending on who you're talking to. Get it wrong and your refusal might sound either presumptuous or insufficiently respectful, both of which could be awkward. Imagine practicing these phrases in different accents. "Sorry, can't eat more, governor," versus "Regrettably, my esteemed liege, my caloric intake capacity has, for this sitting, achieved its apex." It adds a whole new dimension to the performance. The tone was just as important as the words. A flat, monotone delivery of even the most flowery phrase would sound insincere. You needed to inject warmth, gratitude, and perhaps a hint of wistful regret. Regret that your physical limitations were preventing you from further enjoying this unparalleled hospitality. A gentle smile, slightly lowered eyes, maybe a small bow, or inclination of the head while speaking these words would complete the picture. It's the difference between a bored teenager saying whatever and a diplomat carefully choosing words to navigate a sensitive situation. You were aiming for the latter, obviously. Unless you were a bored teenager forced to attend a banquet, in which case, full marks for authenticity, I guess. You also had to be prepared for potential pushback. Some hosts might be particularly insistent, believing that a guest's initial refusal was merely a polite formality and that they genuinely wanted more. This was especially true if you were a valued guest or if the host was trying very hard to impress you. In such cases, your refusal might need to become slightly more emphatic, though still within the bounds of politeness. You might repeat your phrase with slightly more conviction or add a small, convincing physical gesture. Perhaps a hand placed gently but firmly on your stomach, or a slight shaking of the head accompanied by a soft sigh, bringing back those auditory cues. It was a negotiation. The host offered, you graciously declined. The host insisted, you graciously declined, with slightly more emphasis. You had to stand your ground without appearing stubborn or ungrateful. It was like a polite tug-of-war where the rope was made of silk, and the prize was not having to eat another dumpling. The refusal also had to be strategically timed. Offering your verbal refusal too early when others were still eating vigorously might draw undue attention and look like you were abandoning the meal prematurely. Offering it too late when the next course was already being served might be awkward. The ideal moment was typically when the host or a server approached specifically to offer you a refill or another portion, and generally after the main wave of enthusiastic eating had subsided around the table. You wanted to be part of the general slowing down, not the first person to stop, unless you had a really convincing reason or were very confident in your performance. A mainstream historical fact relevant to this is the concept of mianzi, or face, which is deeply ingrained in Chinese culture, both ancient and modern. Face is related to dignity, prestige, and social standing. For a host, having guests eat heartily and show enjoyment reflected well on their face. Conversely, a guest refusing food could potentially cause the host to lose face, implying their efforts were insufficient or the food was unappealing. Therefore, a guest's polite refusal wasn't just about personal comfort. It was an act designed to preserve the host's face while also managing one's own situation. Your refusal had to be phrased in a way that added to the host's face, framing your fullness as a direct result of their exceptional hosting. You have given me so much face with this incredible meal that I am physically incapable of consuming more without risking an explosion, which would be very bad face for both of us. Okay, maybe not quite that direct, but that was the underlying social dynamic. Think about the sheer variety of foods that might be offered at a large banquet. You might need different refusal strategies depending on whether it was rice, a rich stew, a delicate pastry, or a strong drink. Refusing rice might be different from refusing a prized piece of meat. Your verbal response could be tailored. This rice is perfect, truly the foundation of a great meal, but I have laid my foundation and it is sturdy. Versus, this fish is prepared with such skill, a masterpiece. To eat another piece would be to challenge the perfection of the first. The flexibility of your refusal phrases was key. You couldn't have just one go-to line. You needed a repertoire. Consider the mental effort involved. While simultaneously keeping track of your posture, your chopsticks, your breathing, the sounds you were making. And monitoring the host for potential offerings, you also had to have a suitable, polite situation, appropriate refusal phrase ready to deploy at a moment's notice. And you had to deliver it convincingly with the right tone and accompanying gestures. It sounds exhausting, doesn't it? Like playing a complex musical instrument while also doing algebra and trying not to spill a drink. No wonder people probably just ate the extra food sometimes. It might have been less work than the performance required to refuse it. The ultimate goal of the verbal refusal was to provide the host with a graceful way to accept your decision without feeling slighted. Your words gave them face by attributing your inability to eat more to their own excellence and generosity. It closed the loop on your performance of fullness, adding the crucial verbal confirmation to the physical and auditory cues you had already provided. You weren't just looking full and sounding full, you were saying. You were full in the most complimentary way possible. It was the final essential layer of deception, wrapping your empty stomach in a linguistic cloak of appreciative satiety. And if you pulled it off, you had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of ancient Chinese banquet etiquette, emerging mostly still hungry, but socially unscathed. Now, wasn't that worth the mental gymnastics? Probably not if you were truly starving, But hey, historical social survival has its own peculiar rules. Okay, you did it. You navigated the treacherous currents of unsolicited second helpings with the grace of a trained acrobat. You parried the host's generous thrusts of food with linguistic shields forged from politeness and self-deprecation. You are, for all intents and purposes, full. The words have been spoken, the gestures made, the persona solidified. Relief washes over you, thin and fragile like tissue paper, because you know the performance isn't quite over yet. Successfully refusing more food is one hurdle, but now you have to maintain the illusion of comfortable satiety through the rest of the meal, the departure, and potentially even beyond. The immediate aftermath involves sitting there, trying very hard to look relaxed and content, perhaps gently patting your still rumbling stomach through your robes. You watch others finish their meals, engage in conversation, and perhaps receive their own polite refusals. You are no longer actively doing the intense internal work of mimicking digestion or strategically rearranging food. That phase is over. Now it's about being the person who successfully completed the meal. You sip your tea slowly, perhaps admire the intricate patterns on your mostly empty plate, or engage in polite conversation about the quality of the silk your host is wearing or the unseasonably warm weather. The goal is to blend in, to be a picture of post-meal contentment fading into the background subtly. Leaving a banquet in ancient China was often a ritual in itself, not just a casual walk out the door. There would be formal goodbyes, expressions of gratitude to the host for their incredible hospitality, and perhaps exchanges of small gifts or pleasantries. As you offer your thanks, you must still embody the person who just enjoyed a magnificent filling meal. Your voice should be warm, your expression appreciative, maybe a slight happy sigh accompanying your words of departure. You might reiterate how wonderful the meal was, how generous the host, and how truly full you are, not in a way that sounds like an excuse, but as a genuine, slightly overwhelmed acknowledgement of the bounty you supposedly consume. Thank you again, esteemed host, for such a truly overwhelming display of generosity and culinary skill. My stomach is as full as my heart is with gratitude, again linking your fullness to their excellence. As you walk out, you might need to adopt a slightly slower, more measured pace perhaps, with a hand resting lightly on your midsection, subtly suggesting a state of comfortable repletion. You don't want to bound out the door like you're rushing to the nearest street vendor for a real meal. That would unravel the whole performance. You must glide serenely satisfied into the night. It's the final act, the curtain call, where you take your bow as the person who ate a truly epic amount of food, even if in reality your insides feel like an echo chamber. What about the potential consequences of being caught? While outright exposure, someone yelling, "Hey, you didn't eat that," was probably rare unless you were incredibly clumsy, suspicion was possible. If you performed your fullness cues poorly, or if you were known to have a particularly large appetite, a shrewd observer might wonder. The host, having invested time, resources in facing the banquet, would hope that their guests genuinely enjoyed the food. If your feigned fullness seemed insincere, it might cast a subtle shadow. Were you perhaps ill? Did you dislike the food? Were you being rude? These quiet doubts, unspoken but felt in the complex social web, were the real risks. Historians still argue whether the performance of fullness was ever truly intended to deceive, or if it was a widely understood social ritual, a polite fiction that everyone participated in to make the social interaction smoother. Was the host secretly aware that you might not be truly stuffed, but appreciated the politeness of your refusal anyway? It's hard to know how much was genuine deception and how much was a theatrical dance mutually agreed upon by polite society. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this aftermath might be the specific rituals or customs for guests after leaving a banquet. In some wealthier households or specific social circles, guests might be offered digestives teas known to aid digestion, or even escorted home by servants. Accepting a digestive tea while maintaining the facade of fullness adds another layer to the performance. Ah yes, a most welcome beverage. My system could surely benefit from its aid after such a truly ample meal. You're using the offer of help with digestion as further proof of your successful feigned overconsumption. It's like getting a certificate for your acting skills. Then there's the physical reality. You've just spent hours surrounded by delicious food, performing an elaborate pantomime of eating it, and you are genuinely properly hungry. The moment you are alone, perhaps on the journey home, the illusion drops. Your stomach growls loud enough maybe for you to hear it over the creak of your sedan chair or the padding of your own footsteps. This contrast between the polished external performance and the raw internal need must have been striking. You probably start thinking about the leftover steamed buns you have at home, or plotting a discreet visit to a late-night noodle stall, if such things existed and were appropriate for someone of your station. The glamorous, polite world of the banquet gives way to the simple, undeniable truth of an empty stomach. It's a powerful reminder that even in societies bound by strict etiquette, basic human needs persist. A mainstream historical fact relevant to this is the economic and social significance of banquets themselves. These weren't just meals. They were often displays of wealth power and social connection. The host's generosity reinforced their status, and the guest list reflected alliances and hierarchies. Your presence and your seemingly satisfied departure contributed to the success of the event as a whole. A well-attended, seemingly well-enjoyed banquet bolstered the host's reputation. Thus, your performance wasn't just about your own comfort. It played a small part in reinforcing the social structure and the host's place within it. It's like your polite refusal was a tiny, almost invisible brick in the large edifice of ancient Chinese social order. Consider the mental fatigue. You've been on for hours monitoring multiple inputs, food social cues, your own body, performing complex physical and verbal tasks, and maintaining a consistent persona. By the time you leave, you're likely mentally drained, even if physically hungry. This is the less discussed cost of navigating intricate social etiquette, the sheer cognitive load. It makes you appreciate the simpler times of just grabbing a quick bite without needing an audience or a script. Though honestly, even grabbing a quick bite back then probably involved some level of social performance. Was there ever a time when eating was just eating, perhaps only if you were very, very low on the social ladder or completely alone? Even then, you might feel compelled to eat quickly to get back to work or slowly to savor a rare treat. Maybe simple eating is a myth. The relief you feel once you are truly alone and can drop the act is immense. You can stop sucking in your stomach, stop arranging your face into an expression of pleasant fullness, stop mentally rehearsing polite phrases. You can just be and be hungry. The journey home becomes a silent race against your own hunger pangs, a countdown to the moment you can find some actual sustenance. Perhaps you brought a small, unobtrusive snack hidden in your sleeve for just such an emergency. Unlikely at a formal banquet, but maybe a possibility in less formal settings. Or perhaps you just endured dreaming of the cold leftovers back home or the promised meal later. The skills you employed, the strategic breathing, the subtle gestures, the convincing verbal refusals, were not just party tricks. They were tools for social navigation in a world where directness could be impolitic or even damaging. Mastering these forgotten tricks wasn't about being deceitful in a malicious way. It was about greasing the wheels of social interaction, showing respect for the host, and preserving your own position without causing awkwardness. It was a form of social intelligence honed over centuries passed down through observation and practice. You might not find these exact skills useful today. Imagine trying the strategic breathing technique at a modern buffet, but the underlying principles, understanding social cues, managing appearances, communicating indirectly, are still relevant in countless situations. As you finally arrive home, perhaps you discreetly raid the kitchen, or maybe your arrival signals the preparation of a simple, much-needed bowl of congee. That first real bite after hours of performance and hunger must have tasted incredible. It wasn't the rich, complex flavors of the banquet food, but the simple satisfaction of addressing a genuine physical need. And in that moment, the elaborate dance of the banquet feels far away, a strange, almost dreamlike experience. You survived. You navigated the social minefield. You preserved face, yours and your host's, and now finally you get to eat. The performance is over, the audience is gone, and the protagonist gets their long-delayed meal. It brings a quiet satisfaction, a sense of having successfully completed a challenging task. The memory of the banquet might linger, the sights, the sounds, the smells, but now untainted by the pressure of performance. You can recall the beautiful dishes you pretended to eat with a sense of detached appreciation, maybe even a touch of humor at the absurdity of the situation. It's a story you might share later in hushed tones with a close friend about the time you went to the Grand Chancellor's banquet and didn't eat a thing. A small, secret triumph in a world governed by elaborate rules. And so the skills of feigning fullness, of polite refusal, become part of your repertoire. They are not skills you use every day, perhaps, but in a society where appearances and social harmony are paramount, they are invaluable. You learn to control your body, your voice, and your words to create an illusion that served a social purpose. You learn to be both present and absent at the same time. Present at the banquet, but absent from the act of eating. It's a subtle power, the power to navigate restrictions with grace to turn a potential social stumble into a polite pirouette. And now, finally fed, the events of the evening begin to fade, becoming a slightly surreal memory of delicious smelling air and the exhausting effort of appearing perfectly satisfied. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We've journeyed through the quiet, sometimes awkward corners of ancient Chinese banquets, exploring the lengths people went to navigate social pressures around food. We've peered behind the curtain of elaborate rituals, uncovering the very human efforts to balance politeness with personal limits. The rhythmic breathing, the strategic plate arrangements, the carefully chosen words. These weren't just historical footnotes. They were the tools people used to move through their world one complicated meal at a time. As the details of this evening's exploration begin to soften in your mind, let the sounds around you become gentler. The edges of your thoughts grow hazy. Feel the weight of your body relaxing into whatever surface holds you. Let the images of ancient dining halls and whispered refusals drift away. There's no need to perform now, no need to pretend. Just quiet, just rest. Allow yourself to sink deeper, calmer, letting the silence and stillness settle over you. The past recedes, the present fades, and the only thing left is the soft, gentle pull towards sleep. Breathe easy, sleep well.